Right now, 210 years ago, one of the most famous battles in history was reaching its crisis point. The Battle of Waterloo has gone down in history, rightly or wrongly, as a turning point in European history. It was Napoleon Bonaparte's final battle, and his final defeat ushered in an era of relative peace after nearly a quarter of a century of almost constant war. The battle has been mythologized, manipulated, and misunderstood for almost 2 centuries, from Marshal Grouchy's supposed betrayal of Napoleon to arguments about who was responsible for the victory. Most of what people think they know about Waterloo is probably wrong. So what actually happened in the fields of Belgium on the 18th of June 1815? Who were the men who gave their lives in this era-defining clash? And on the 210th anniversary of the battle, why does Waterloo still matter? Tonight, the Napoleonic Wars YouTube channel brings together leading historians with cutting-edge drone footage to help you see the battlefield like never before. We'll be discussing what it was like to fight in the line during the period, exploding myths, and asking what happened to these men once the fighting was over. This is the Battle of Waterloo live, starting right now, here on the Napoleonic Wars channel. Folks, good evening and welcome to the Battle of Waterloo live here on the Napoleonic Wars YouTube channel. It's a pleasure to be delivering this coverage, excuse me, which is delivered from the Napoleonic Wars podcast and YouTube channel, but is being done in aid of the Napoleonic and Revolutionary War Graves charity, an organization that is very close to my heart and we'll be saying a little bit more about over the course of the live. I can see folks tuning in the chat. Please do say hello. Let us know where you're tuning in from. But let me give you a flavor of what's in store over the course of the next few hours. Right now, 210 years ago, the crisis moment of the Battle of Waterloo was unfolding. Those central points that Wellington had occupied were on the cusp of falling, and indeed 2 of them would fall over the time that we are going to be on air in the next few hours. In that same period of time, Napoleon's elite Imperial Guard would make a do-or-die assault on the Allied line in 3 waves, all of which would be sent backwards. Yet it wouldn't be enough. The Prussians would break through at Plancenoit in Napoleon's right rear and at Papelotte in the northeast of the battlefield, whilst Wellington, in the wake of the Imperial Guard's assault, would go on an all-out offensive, sending his entire line forwards. Waterloo would see the end of Napoleon's vaguest of hopes of re-establishing his lost European empire. Over the course of the next few hours, we are going to be talking about the battle in real time, talking about what was happening when and its implications for the wider strategic situation that Napoleon faced. And we'll be doing it using the very latest of historical knowledge with some of the world's leading experts, folks like Luke Reynolds, Graham Callister, Liam Telfer will be joining us, as will Evan Wilson. And we'll be talking about things like the attack of Derlon's First Corps, the nature of what it was like to be a soldier during this period. We'll be discussing the realities for these soldiers in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars and bringing it all together in order to think about the legacies of this conflict. As I say, this is all being done in support of the Napoleonic and Revolutionary War Graves charity, an organization set up in 2021 that seeks to care for the graves of veterans of this period and also tries to fight for these veterans so that when they are disinterred as a result of archaeological processes or building programs or whatever it might be, they aren't simply put in a box and left in storage. The NRWGC works in order to try and give these people dignity so that they can have that marked place in the earth. And if you feel that that's an organization and a cause that is worthy, then please do consider supporting it. Details are literally flickering across the bottom of the screen right now. But there's a way that you can support us without doing anything other than pressing a single button. Because I have said that for every single like that this stream gets, over the course of the next few hours, we will be donating £1 to the NRWGC. Now, it doesn't sound a lot, but quite how much it ends up being is completely down to you. Because I can see we have a certain number of people watching the stream right now, and we don't have that many likes. So if you like this stream, that will guarantee an extra £1 for the NRWGC. And I will make a commitment that if we reach 200 likes over the course of the next 3.5 hours, I will double whatever the final total is when it comes to that donation. So there you are, folks. A gauntlet has been laid down. Please do like the stream and see what you can do to support this fantastic cause. We've got folks tuning in and commenting about where they're tuning in from around the world. Hello, Todd, who's tuning in from sunny California. Welcome, Todd, long-standing friend of the show. Robin Brasher, who often pops up on our YouTube channel. Hello, Robin. Evening all from Norfolk, UK. David Maxwell tuning in from Michigan in the United States. Welcome, everyone. Folks, please do get involved in the chat and post any questions that you have. We will be having dedicated segments across the course of the live stream, talking about some of your questions and answering some of them. So please do get involved, say hello, and offer your thoughts so that we can answer any queries you have and also explode some myths and have some fun along the way. But let's get on with it, shall we? Let's start talking about some actual battle-y stuff. What's been happening right now? Well, what I'm showing you now is drone footage from the Waterloo campaign. Funnily enough, this is not live. I'm not piloting a drone from the southern UK coast whilst also running this live stream, but this is footage shot a couple of years ago of the Waterloo battlefield, and this very specific shot, as you can see, is now coming down to cavalry height, because right now, 210 years ago, Ney's cavalry were in the midst of their 2 hours that they spent charging, reforming, and charging again. Nobody knows quite how many charges the French heavy cavalry attempted over the course of this 2-hour period. It's estimated by some to be as many as 15, others put it down as low as 6. Now, these cavalry attacks had virtually no impact on the Allied line. There are some indications that maybe a couple of battalions got a bit shaky and sort of pulled back, but no units broke and ran, as was the intent. The Allies, quite frankly, could see the French coming. For one thing, this charge wasn't so much an all-out speedy charge at the Allied line as a canter through some incredibly muddy fields. Bear in mind that it had rained heavily the night before Waterloo, and as a result, the ground would have been sodden. It's clay soil. It wasn't going to dry out over the course of a day. It takes literally days to dry, and I say that from experience, having walked this battlefield many times. So the French cavalry would have advanced at best something of a canter. And that would have meant that the Allies could well and truly have seen them coming. So what would you do as a defense against cavalry? Well, if you're a fan of the period, you will know that there is a formation that infantry have designed for exactly this purpose, and that is to form square. I'm just going to let that footage loop and play through again for you, so that you can continue to enjoy it as I'm speaking here. And with plenty of time to do so, all of these regiments not only form very stable, very cohesive squares, but they also get arranged by the staff officers into something a little bit like a chessboard formation. That gives the French cavalry plenty of space to flow in between, but also gives very clearly defined fields of fire for the Allied infantry. It enables them to basically fire on the French cavalry without fear of hitting an adjacent square. So the French fundamentally find themselves facing a series of these fortified, almost hedgehog-like square or more like rectangular blocks that you can't break unless the troops lose their nerve. And none of the Allied troops do, in fact, lose their nerve. Now, the flip side to this is that a square is a great defense against cavalry. It is a sitting duck for artillery. So when the French cavalry pulled back down into the valley, which the drone is traversing now and just starting to climb up the ridge, the French artillery on the far side of the valley could in fact fire. And it is said from some of the accounts that the Allied infantry preferred to have the French cavalry swirling among them because they knew they had the bottle to hold their nerve. But when the cavalry pulled back, the artillery opened up and then they were vulnerable. So actually, the times when the French were charging them were something of a respite in terms of the amount of death that was being dealt out. Now, much more could have actually been done with this opportunity. Ney did have a small amount of infantry reserve that he could have called up at this point. There is actually far too late an attempt to call up that division. But Ney, for reasons that we don't entirely understand, didn't seem to know that this was an option available to him. And the thinking is that effectively Ney had sort of lost his situational awareness. And this is something that is thought to periodically be a problem for Ney, that he does sort of seem to become a little bit blinkered in certain situations and loses that wider awareness and therefore loses that ability to call up not only infantry support, but also fundamentally artillery support. Now, sure, the French cavalry will have had galloper guns with them, but in terms of very dedicated and coordinated artillery fire to really exploit this threat that the cavalry posed, forcing the Allies to form into square, nothing is done in anywhere near like an effective enough way. So these cavalry charges are fundamentally unsupported and they achieve very little, which begs the question, why bother? Why bother with all of these cavalry attacks, particularly if you've done it once and it's not working? Why bother to keep charging and continue charging, whether it's 6, 10, or 15 times? The answer is that the cavalry charges weren't meant to break Wellington's line. It's often said that Ney takes one look through his telescope at Wellington sort of pulling back and rearranging his forces, which may or may not have been the case, and then immediately sort of cries, Wellington retreats, gallops on his horse, summons all the cavalry and charges off, hoping to sort of ride to glory. Now, there are two problems with that. One is that it becomes very apparent very quickly that the Allies haven't broken. So if that was your aim, you would just stop. You wouldn't keep charging pointlessly and slaughtering your men completely needlessly. You would pull back and reconsider the situation. So that doesn't kind of make any logical sense. The other thing that's often missed is that these weren't meant to break the Allied line in the first place. This was a diversionary attack. It was trying to pin Wellington's right, all the forces that he had in that western part of the battlefield, down. Now, why would you want to do that? Well, because earlier in the day, the French have come very close to success with their first infantry assault on the Allied line using Derlon's corps. I'm going to interview Graham Callister a little bit later about that infantry attack. But the idea was that although Derlon's troops had been shattered by the charge of the Union and Household Heavy Cavalry brigades, there were reinforcements that could have been brought up and were brought up by Napoleon over the course of the day. And those were moved into that same section of the field. The idea was that Napoleon was going to try again, attacking along the same route in probably a very similar manner, hoping this time to actually break through the Allied lines. Now, Wellington wasn't going to sit idly by, and Napoleon knew that. So by keeping Wellington's infantry pinned in place on the right flank, it meant that he couldn't redistribute his forces. So for all that Ney gets a huge amount of criticism for just charging off like this, actually, it's a false criticism because that was never what he was doing. This was always about trying to keep Wellington tied down so that a much bigger game of kind of three-dimensional chess could be played. Now, that second infantry assault never actually came on the French right flank because of the arrival of the Prussians. And we'll say more about that over the course of the live stream. But that gives you an indication of where we are within the course of the battle itself. I can see folks in the chat saying hello. Please do, folks, remember to like the stream. For every like we get, we are donating £1 to the Napoleonic and Revolutionary War Graves charity. So the more you like, the more the charity gets. And as I've said, if we get to 200 likes, I will double. Did I say 200 or 250? I'm going to make it 200 now. If we get to 200 likes, I will double whatever the final total is. So sure, £1 per like doesn't sound much, but if you are willing to support us with a very simple tap of that like button, then we will respond in kind. And do jump in the chat with any questions. Folks are also saying where they've come from. John Haynes, welcome. I know John does some fantastic work himself in regards to Napoleonic veterans. So welcome, John. John is part of the team at Kensal Green Cemetery that does a lot of research into the folks who are buried there. Does some fantastic work in terms of helping people to understand that heritage. And I know that's something that the NRWGC sort of feels very strongly and kind of responds to. So if you aren't already aware of Kensal Green, there are, as John says, about 300 Napoleonic veterans buried there, and they do have tours that they do periodically. So please do check out their website for more details on those so that you can perhaps go to London and enjoy one of those tours where John, no doubt, will be guiding you. Zach Johnson joins us from New York City. Hello, Zach. Zach, hi, Zach from Zach. It's sometimes a bit odd coming across somebody with a similar name to me because my name isn't particularly common. Geraint Thatcher says hi. Hello, Geraint, joining us on Facebook because we are also streaming on Facebook. And yes, folks, I will add the likes from Facebook and YouTube together. So wherever you are, just smack that like button. If you're not already subscribed, please also subscribe to the show so you can find your way back to more fantastic content. And Geraint asks a really significant question. How many troops were diverted to Napoleon's right against the Prussians at this time? This is a fantastic Geraint. This is a fantastic Geraint question. It was going to be a fantastic question, Geraint, but it's a very you question as well, Geraint. Folks will know Geraint from social media. He does love to ask some really pertinent questions at times. Effectively, the vast majority of Lebeau's corps is the answer, Geraint. So you have to bear in mind that over the course of the battle, more and more Prussian troops feed in, and so more and more of Lebeau's corps basically gets fed in response into initially holding Plancenoit and a section of the battlefield heading north from Plancenoit in a direct line towards Papelotte. And in fact, to help with a description of this, I'm just going to bring up a satellite image of the battlefield. Just bear with me 1 second, folks. There it should be for you. Hopefully you can still see everything smoothly on the screen. Yes, it appears that you can. Now you will see me actually preparing for an interview with the BBC tomorrow on NRWGC's work. But if we just zoom in here to the battlefield of Waterloo. So this is the Allied ridge over the top of your picture. The farm of Hougoumont is on the left-hand side with the Monument aux Soldats Français marked there. The Monument aux Belges is the crossroads. That's where Wellington's elm tree was. This, you can see, is the Ferme de la Haison. Papelotte is over here on the right-hand side of the field. It's now an equestrian centre. At the time, it was a farmhouse, and Wellington garrisons all three of these farms: Hougoumont, La Haison, and Papelotte, with fundamentally a multinational force actually of troops. And these are designed to act as breakwaters because it effectively sort of hems the French in a little bit. It kind of gives them less space to just kind of pick where they want to attack, because each of these fortified farms effectively ends up bristling, and it just kind of creates little pockets of fire. So rather than going straight up the middle, Napoleon has to sort of negotiate around some of these sites. And that actually becomes part of the story of why Derlon's attack falters in the way that it does. So these do actually work in terms of acting as those breakwaters. So Geraint asks, what are we looking at? So this is Plancenoit. Now, at the time, Plancenoit was much, much smaller, probably a couple of streets at best. You can see sort of the evidence of urban sprawl around the bottom here. So this section of the battlefield here, from Papelotte down to Plancenoit, ends up being increasingly filled with Lebeau's corps. So initially it's a division either side of Plancenoit, and also some troops defending the centre, and reserves have to be pushed in. And bear in mind, Lebeau's division is the weakest in Lebeau's corps is the weakest in Napoleon's army. So whereas the vast majority of Napoleon's corps consisted of at least 12 infantry divisions, in Derlon's case, I think it's more like 16. at least 12 infantry regiments. In Derlon's case, 16 infantry regiments. Lebeau's got 10 infantry regiments, so it's a much, much weaker corps. It doesn't have dedicated cavalry support either. It doesn't have its own cavalry division, so a much weaker force that is sort of trying to fend off what becomes initially one Prussian corps and then two Prussian corps as more and more Prussian reinforcements arrive in their march from Wavre. We've got other questions coming in. Chris on YouTube. Has modern archaeology made any significant discoveries that have shifted views and our understanding of this much covered battle? Yes, we're going to talk about Hougoumont in a little while. And you're going to hear a great deal about how we now understand Hougoumont far better and see it as a far more complex action than previously anybody had assumed. So yes, absolutely, Chris, there are discoveries, and we're going to be talking you through those in due course. Geraint, once again on Facebook, for the battle, how much tactical handling did Napoleon do compared to Ney or Soult? I ask because Napoleon's skill was always operational strategy rather than tactics, and post-battle in France, he said that Ney was insane on the battle. Well, yes, I quite agree. Napoleon does scapegoat Ney. He also scapegoats Grouchy. But you've got to remember, this is Napoleon. This is the guy who comes up with a vision, usually has Berthier to support him, and then kind of through that is able to kind of say, I want people here doing this at a certain point in time. Now, there is a significant debate about to what extent does Napoleon relinquish strategic control at around 4 o'clock in order to receive treatment. It's often commented that he's suffering from hemorrhoids over the course of the Waterloo campaign. Does make it quite hard to ride a horse. I don't speak from experience there, but you just kind of use a little bit of imagination. You can probably work that out for yourself. So it is said that he's receiving treatment. Now, how much control does he relinquish? Well, that's a debate that historians are still having to this day. Personally, I'm always very skeptical of the idea that Napoleon would just sit back for a couple of hours and let Ney kind of ride the cavalry to their destruction, as Napoleon later claims. And that's fundamentally what he's trying to imply, that Ney just kind of goes nuts, charges off with the cavalry, and everybody goes, oh yeah, no, okay, you carry on, Ney. This is Napoleon's army. And for all that there are many, many communication problems over the course of this campaign, I really don't think that that's kind of in either Soult's or Ney's or Napoleon's kind of nature to allow that to happen. Folks, do please keep the questions coming in, but I am now going to turn to the question of how we got here, fundamentally, with a little bit of a chat about what happens at Quatre and Ligny. Please do keep liking that stream. Remember that for every like we get, we are donating £1 to the NRWGC, and if we get to 200 likes, I will double whatever our final count is. So I can see we've got plenty of people in the stream, but not anywhere near as many likes. So please, folks, if you want to support a great cause, whack the like button, and it will help a very worthwhile charity indeed. So, Quatre and Ligny, fundamentally the battles that make Waterloo possible. The morning of the 16th of June, 1815 is effectively very quiet. Napoleon invades the previous day and has a very ambitious strategy to try and split the two armies. The Anglo-Dutch plus Hanoverian plus Brunswick force, plus some King's German Legion as well, if you don't class those as Anglo, all under the command of the Duke of Wellington, and then a Prussian force under Marshal Blucher. And his idea is to basically use his army as a boot to kick these two armies apart. The idea being that their communication lines and their supply lines kind of run at right angles away from each other. So if he can force them to withdraw on their supply lines, he can encircle each one individually and then beat it. Now, it's a strategy that doesn't end up working, but it comes very, very close on the first couple of days. He steals a march on the Allies. It takes them a day to gather their forces. And the story of both battles is effectively Wellington and Blucher being hamstrung by the fact that they don't have their entire forces with them. In Blucher's case, he's missing a quarter of his army. Fourth Corps will not make the Battle of Ligny at all. When it comes to Wellington, it's a desperate pell-mell struggle that sees him feed in his reinforcements the second they arrive, whether it's Picton's division somewhere around about 3:30, whether it's Cook's brigade of guards much later towards the end of the battle. There's a lot of kind of ebbing and flowing at Quatre. But the reason that the morning is quiet is that all armies are trying to kind of figure out the state of play. Ney has significant problems at Quatre, not least because he's only been given command of that wing of the army literally the previous afternoon. Sometime between, I believe, 2, 3, maybe as late as 4 o'clock, he has a meeting with Napoleon outside Charleroi, and Napoleon says, I'm giving you command of the left wing of the army. Head north, fundamentally find Wellington and keep him pressed. He doesn't get orders to take the crossroads of Quatre until the day of the 16th. So many folks criticize him for not securing the crossroads on the first day. The reason he doesn't is actually because of independent thinking. The Constant de Rebecque realizes that the French are moving north out of Charleroi and decides to dispatch Saxe-Weimar's brigade from the Nassau contingent and deploy them to Quatre. Now, Saxe-Weimar's men arrive literally in the nick of time. They have about 15 minutes to spare before the French advanced cavalry screen starts riding up within musket shot of the crossroads. And there's an exchange of fire that by the end of that evening on the 15th sees the Saxe-Weimar brigade down to about 10 rounds a man. So it's a significant firefight that they get into, but the French pull back. Ney hasn't got orders to take the crossroads, so he doesn't feel the need to really press it. But all he knows is he's made some contact. He doesn't know what he's facing. Likewise, Napoleon, with the right wing of the army, doesn't have a clear indication of just how much of the Prussian army is in front of him. He wants Blucher to fight him, of course he does, because he backs himself and he thinks that he will win. But he doesn't know that. And the French are struggling with these communication problems. Napoleon famously doesn't have Berthier with him, his kind of almost genius level chief of staff. Berthier has fallen / decided to jump / has been helped out of a window. Nobody quite knows the reality. I'm sure somebody will immediately jump into the chat and talk about defenestration of generals continuing to this day. We don't know, fundamentally. There are many theories about, was he pushed? It's very hard to know. From what I remember of our interviews with Rachel Stark, who runs our Marshall series on the Napoleonic Wars podcast, she made the point that Berthier had a child not that long before his tragic fall. So how does that feed into the equation? Well, nobody can really know. But whatever the reason, Berthier isn't at Napoleon's side during the Waterloo campaign. Soult is given the chief of staff position instead, and Soult really isn't anywhere near as effective as Berthier in terms of that chief of staff role and the management of communication. Now, things aren't peachy for the Allies either. The British have to rush to the battlefield. There are questions about the loyalty of Belgian troops. Many of them have previously served in the French force. Which means there's concern about will they just defect to the French at the first given opportunity. There are also questions about the quality, because a lot of this army consists of militia. Now, what this means, the Prussians are also facing their challenges. They need to gather, and they're not particularly unified. The Saxon contingent of troops literally just gets sent home because of a mass mutiny. So there are real concerns in the Allied camp about whether or not their army is up to the challenge. And there's a very large Landwehr contingent in the Prussian army, which is kind of a form of militia, perhaps slightly better trained than regular militia, that the Prussians bring to this battlefield. So nobody's entirely happy in the run-up to this campaign. So what happens on the morning? Well, both sides try and work out their strategy. Wellington and Blucher meet near Ligny at a mill near Brie, and they reaffirm a strategy that they had committed to long before the Waterloo campaign had begun, which was that given the opportunity, they would fight combined, i.e. they would bring their forces together and overwhelm Napoleon with sheer weight of numbers. It's a strategy that they know works because they've done it before. This is exactly how the Allies had beaten Napoleon during the 1814 and 1813 campaigns. So they know that if they overwhelm Napoleon, they can actually achieve victory. And that's what they seek to do over the course of the campaign. It's the plan on the 16th of June, i.e. that Blucher will stand and fight at Ligny, and Wellington will be the inverted commas cavalry coming over the hill, who will sweep in, roll up Napoleon's flank, and therefore defeat his army and snuff out this campaign. Now, that doesn't happen because, as we know, Wellington is too heavily engaged at Quatre. His reinforcements don't get there fast enough for him to be able to be confident that he can start detaching troops to go and help Blucher. Now, what that means is that when Blucher and Wellington both pull back on the 17th, there's this constant exchange of letters about, can we make this strategy work? And early in the hours of the 18th of June, Blucher effectively gives this cast iron commitment: I am coming, Wellington, with at least a quarter of my army, perhaps more. So if you're ready and able and willing to stand and fight at Waterloo, I will come. And this is the agreement that Blucher's coming, therefore I stand. And that's the kind of effectively the role reversal. So Waterloo ends up being the inverse of what should have happened on the 16th of June. In terms of the fighting at Quatre, well, let's have a little look at the Quatre battlefield. This is drone footage taken again a couple of years ago, showing the Quatre battlefield from the Allied perspective. So about to appear in the left of shot is the crossroads of Les Quatre Bras, which is a key kind of line of communication, and this was going to be the key sort of communication line from the Allies down to Blucher's forces at Ligny. So you can see the crossroads appearing in shot now. And if you've got an eye for landscape, you will notice that there's a bit of a problem for Ney in terms of the terrain. It's quite a ripply landscape, and you'll see this even more so in some of the lower level drone footage. This is taken from quite a high level of about 100 meters. Ney took one look at that terrain and kind of went, this is classic Wellington territory, and I'm expecting to fight Wellington here. And with all of these ripples in the terrain, I can't be confident of where Wellington has or hasn't hidden forces, because this is what Wellington is known for by this point. Wellington is known for this idea of reverse slopes. It's a tactic that he's used consistently in Spain and Portugal. He's a known quantity, and he's fought Ney. So Ney has seen this happen and has learnt the hard way, which therefore means that when he sees this landscape, he is twitchy, and so he isn't inclined to charge in. Now, this is appearing on screen now is Hougoumont Farm, which is one of a few kind of buildings from the battle. Hougoumont was briefly garrisoned. When Ney attacks, he attacks from the south of this. Apologies, why is the footage stalled? There we go. Effectively from the top of picture. So south is at the top of your picture now. And he attacks at about 2 o'clock, but he hasn't got his forces arrayed with him. He hasn't got big kind of reinforcements ready. And so that means he has to kind of make these gentle probing attacks. Facing him, the 27th Jaegers from the Dutch-Belgian contingent, and they make decent progress. The ground was quite marshy. We know that from the accounts. It was also broken with many, many more field hedge boundaries. So they had a tough time in terms of making progress. And it takes them about an hour to cover what is really sort of a 10-minute walk under normal conditions. 27th Jaegers pull back, and the French take Hougoumont Farm. Now, there'd been no plan to defend Hougoumont. It hadn't been loopholed, it hadn't been prepared in any way for this attack. It was just sort of lightly garrisoned with a couple of companies from the Saxe-Weimar contingent. And that means that they pull out. They're not ready to defend this farm to the death, which makes complete sense. So by 3 o'clock, they've taken the farmhouse, and the Prince of Orange, who's in command because Wellington is still on his way back from that meeting with Blucher, effectively sees that this is a really dangerous situation. He orders a counterattack that fails, but crucially, it does buy time. And it's quite a catastrophic failure, but it just keeps the French occupied, because Hougoumont would have been a great point from which to launch at the crossroads itself. And you can kind of see this in the drone footage. In fact, if I rewind this a little, Corps is just behind that tree line. So you can see it's not that far. Maybe a 10, 15-minute walk from Corps to the crossroads. So it's a very good point from which to launch directly at the crossroads and take them. Now, Orange recognizes that. And that's why he launches this counterattack. 3:30 p.m. Picton arrives with about 3,500 British infantry in the nick of time. The Brunswickers also arrive with their first line and light battalions, and this enables a bit of a stabilization to basically plug the gaps that are being created by the Dutch-Belgian troops who are being pushed back under very significant weight of numbers. Ney definitely has the numerical advantage at this point in time. The Brunswickers plug the gap. In fact, this drone footage is taken from immediately above the Brunswick position. They plug this gap between the main highway that runs north-south and a wood called the Bossu Wood. And if I share screen for you for a moment, we will be able to take a little look at the battlefield. So there is Waterloo in relation to these other battlefields. This is where Ligny is. This is where Ligny is. This is where Quatre is. So as we zoom in on Ligny, this area was once filled with the Bois de Bossu. It's effectively a wood. This is Pyramont Farm down here. This was also garrisoned briefly by, I believe it's the 8th Dutch Militia. Corps is in the centre here. And the Brunswickers are used to plug this gap that opens up in the line from the highway to the Bossu Wood. The trouble is, the Brunswickers are really, really inexperienced. So inexperienced, these are conscripts fundamentally, that they don't know, well, they know how to deploy into line, but their commander, the Duke of Brunswick, isn't confident that they can stand. If they deploy into line, will they stand under the face of artillery fire, infantry pressure, and potentially even cavalry assaults? And because he's not confident about that, he leaves them in column. Now, that's great as a defense against cavalry, but it makes them a sitting duck for artillery fire. So they take huge punishment. And unsurprisingly, this leads to them eventually breaking. Now, with an eye on the time, I do want to just rattle on. We've got some fantastic comments coming in the chat. Jonathan particularly is being incredibly generous. Jonathan, I'm not ignoring you. I'm going to come back to you in just a second because I do want to address your exceptionally generous offer in just a moment. But let me finish on Quatre first. So, as I say, at 3:30, the reinforcements have arrived, but it doesn't take long for the Brunswickers to pull back. Now, as they do so, the Brunswickers hussars try to charge to cover that pulling back, but they're broken before they even hit the French cavalry that's loitering, trying to sort of instill fear. And that basically leaves a gap in that line, which the French lancers then try to exploit, and they catch the British infantry exposed and on the hop. The light company of the 42nd Regiment is basically ridden over, just literally slammed to the floor by these lancers. They do not stand a chance. The rest of the 42nd manages to form a square with the French cavalry in amongst them. It's an incredible feat. And they basically force the sides of this square shut, trapping some of the French lancers inside. It's an astonishing feat at any point in military history, but it comes at a cost. They lose 284 of their men killed or wounded. The 44th Regiment, meanwhile, who are to the right of them, from the French perspective, to the left from the Allied, they do something even more astonishing. They decide that it's too late to form square. And the square is what you need as a defense against cavalry. So what they do is they turn their rear rank around, do a 180. So they've got muskets pointing in both directions and open fire. That does quite an effective job, but it doesn't completely solve the problem. And some lancers do head for the colour party. These are the regimental flags. You have a king's colour and a regimental colour. They head for the colour party. And Ensign Christie effectively manages to save one of the standards by falling on it when he is stabbed in the face with a lance. So he takes a lance to the eye, a horrific wound. Apologies if you're in the midst of having your dinner. That probably should have come with a content warning. But it does manage to save that colour. And Ney's progress is fundamentally stalled by the lack of reinforcements because Napoleon has hamstrung him. Again, not only has he given Ney the details of his command far too late, he's also taken one of Ney's 2 corps. And there's this big problem with communication in terms of when Ney is told about this, because the messenger ends up coming across Derlon before he comes across Ney. So what should have happened is that the messenger should have gone to Ney, told him what Napoleon's plan was, and then ridden off to tell Derlon. But instead, he finds Derlon first. So in the interest of being efficient, he tells Derlon, the emperor is summoning you to Ligny to fight there, as much needed reinforcements, go at once, and then goes to tell Ney. Ney finds out about this, having had this plan in his head about, right, so I'm going to keep pressing there, and now I'm going to feed in these reinforcements, I'm going to break the Allied line, and then immediately has what can generously be described as a bit of a wobbly. Jonathan Stark in the chat is asking about instability, possible PTSD. I'm going to answer that properly in just a moment, but there is certainly something about Ney at this moment, which means he doesn't respond rationally, and he summons Derlon back. What this means is that Derlon spends the 16th of June marching from Quatre to Ligny, to then, as he's getting to Ligny, get the orders to come back to Quatre, and so he marches between the 2 battlefields and achieves nothing. Had he been involved at either battle, he would have changed the course of the campaign, because Derlon has somewhere in the region of 18,000 men with him. The infantry alone are something like 10 or 12,000 at this point in time. It doesn't matter where he fights, he will turn the tide in favor of the French. But because he's not at either, it means that his, a fifth of the French army is fundamentally rendered meaningless and useless. Ney continues to get kind of harassing letters from Napoleon saying, the fate of France depends on your success at Quatre. I need you to take that crossroads. And he's not got the reinforcements to do so. So in desperation, he orders General Kellerman to charge with his cuirassiers. These guys are 800 strong, but they're charging an army of 20,000 infantry. There is no way in hell this was ever going to work. But the most astonishing thing is, it very nearly did. The cuirassiers charge at full gallop. They haven't got the opportunity to advance at the canter because they can't afford to give the Allies time to respond. They need to utilize that element of surprise. And they catch the 2nd Battalion 69th on the hop because they've just been ordered to deploy into line under orders of the Prince of Orange. They end up being gutted. They lose a colour. The 33rd Regiment ends up breaking and running for the tree line. The other regiments hold. And so you've got, again, this gap that opens up. They're briefly at the crossroads, but they get fire from the reserves. And what this all means is that effectively they're not able to do anything significant with this opportunity they've created, and they have to pull back. But had there been more reserves, they could quite probably have broken through at that point. A division of infantry would have done horrendous things for the Allied line. But by 6 p.m., Cook's Guards division arrives and tips the balance back in the favour of the Allies. And effectively, Quatre ends as a stalemate. So that's the story of Quatre. I do now want to take the opportunity to bring in not only some of the very generous and interesting questions that have come up, but also my partner in crime, my co-host, one of my co-hosts on the Napoleonic Wars podcast, described this morning by one of our guests, Graham Callister, as one of the greatest minds in Napoleonic broadcasting. Liam Telfer is in the chat. Well, he's not in the chat. He's in the studio with us this evening. Hello, Liam. How are you doing, my friend?
I'm very well. I'm very well. Apologies being slightly late to the party, sort of making like a Prussian somewhat. And perhaps Graham's been spending too much time out in the sun but his kind words are, incredibly received. So I'm truly grateful for that.
Speaking of things we're very grateful from, hello to Jonathan Stark, who is joining us from Armenia. About a quarter of an hour ago, he posted a very generous comment that I then promptly ignored. I wasn't being rude. I was just mid-flow. And so I wanted to kind of keep going. Otherwise, I'd get kind of sidelined by this and kind of lose my track. But Jonathan says, if you'll agree, I'll join you in doubling the like contributions of the NRWGC, of which he's a member. And yes, absolutely, Jonathan. I will absolutely second you on in doing that. Thank you very much for the generosity and the support. Todd Campbell chimes in from the USA. Todd is one of the trustees of the NRWGC with his thanks. But Jonathan's also asked about Ney's instability after 1812 and asked the question, PTSD question mark. Liam, welcome to the show. I'm going to throw you in at the deep end here. It's not so much throwing you under the bus as throwing you in the wake of a cuirassier, throwing you in the face of a cuirassier charge. What are your thoughts on this, particularly as somebody, you were a soldier for many years, serving with the household division, with the household cavalry. You've seen this firsthand. What are your thoughts in terms of our ability to assess this sort of 200 years later?
I think in terms of our ability to assess it, that's the most difficult question, right? What we have to do is, and it's something I've considered with some of my research into the period, it's about really dissecting those primary source accounts, those memoirs, those diaries, those letters, really dissecting those and reading in between the lines and trying to pick up some of the language that might be associated with mental illness or PTSD or something like that. There's a quote from Wheeler. I think it's from somewhere in after the wars, but while he's still serving, and there's a sergeant that was served throughout the period, and all of a sudden in a
Oh, Liam, we seem to have lost you ever so slightly there. We are live, folks. Anything can happen. You're back. Carry on,
I'm
mate.
back. Yeah, Wheeler basically talks about this sergeant suffering from an affliction of nerves. It could be construed as PTSD, but it's very, very difficult for us 200 years down the line to sort of inflict almost any medical condition, even physical medical conditions, without assessment, without physical assessment. It's very difficult for us to tell, really. And is Ney suffering from PTSD? I think it would be, I don't want to belittle it, but it'd be almost convenient if he was, as an explanation for some of his behaviors. But I think it's very, very difficult for us to really sort of nail that condition to him.
Yeah, it's as you say, it's something that comes up in both of our research, and I've certainly come across court cases of individuals who are found sort of wandering the countryside aimlessly. Now, immediately you listen to that and think of shell shock, right? And today we kind of look at shell shock as, well, that's fundamentally what we now might describe as PTSD in terms of that terminology that's used. So there is certainly evidence that might suggest it, but there's always that challenge of knowing. We can certainly say that Ney suffers from erratic behavior, but then there's a question of whether or not that's anything new. If you think about what happens at the Battle of the Coa, he rips apart a chunk of the light division completely, outflanks them, catches them on surprise, has a huge success on his hands, and then once the rest of the light division pulls back across the bridge, decides to charge frontally across this very narrow bridge. Complete waste of lives. And what it means is that by the end of the day, French casualties are higher than Allied casualties because of these completely pointless assaults. And it's another example of the same thing, of Ney losing that tactical awareness. So there's certainly plenty of evidence to suggest a continuation. Now, that's not to dispute what you're saying, Jonathan. Ney commands the rear guard. He gets cut off. We have Josh Proven on the show periodically, who will tell you quite emphatically, well, that's Ney's own fault. And sure, they fight their way out. But, that leaves a mark. What's particularly curious is that Napoleon doesn't seem to have PTSD. There's some research done by Ed Koss on this that shows that he doesn't have a single indicator in terms of that, but does have very strong indicators of narcissism. So hopefully that gives you some food for thought there, Jonathan. And thanks again for that very generous offer to match our commitment to double any Patreon subscriptions, the value of any Patreon subscriptions that we get on the Napoleonic Wars Pod Patreon page. So the value of that will be doubled. And as I've said many times already, if you like the stream, folks, what we have said is that we will donate £1 for every like that the stream gets. And I am now trying to bring up the YouTube stream as I'm watching this. And I see we've got 30 likes already. So that's £30 to the NRWGC. But I have said that if we get to 200 likes, I will double it. So there's your gauntlet. Like the stream, and go and get your friends and tell them to like the stream. All it takes is a push of a button, and this fantastic charity gets some money. So please do support us there if you can. Now, I haven't talked about the Prussians yet, Liam. Liam will not be surprised to hear that I am massively behind schedule already, and we are maybe through half an hour of the content that I'd planned, nearly an hour into the stream. But I do want to talk about Ligny because it's such a problem that happens with this this battle, this campaign rather. My apologies, where the Prussians get pushed to the sidelines, and I don't want to be guilty of that over the course of this one. So here's a little bit of footage from Ligny. Now, we do face unique challenges when we try and film many of these battlefields. In fact, Austerlitz suffers from a similar problem in the airfields are nearby, and there are very important, very logical laws that say that you cannot fly drones within a certain distance from the airfields. So chunks of the Ligny battlefield are covered by these no-fly restrictions. Fortunately, some chunks are accessible. So this is taken just to the north of Saint-Amand. So I'm going to pause the footage and just show you folks what the battlefield looks like from a satellite image, which should be up on your screens now. So this is, as we've just been talking about, Quatre. And if you just head down the road, very nearby is Ligny. So this is the Prussian position through the center of your screen. The Ligny Brook, or the Lean Brook, sort of snakes through this area. And today it's barely a dribble. It's a very, very small stream. It was a bit more significant in 1815, and there was a lot of marshy ground either side of it, which made it much more of an obstacle. And you've got Saint-Amand. This is a key area that becomes a focal point for fighting. Wagnerly is the extreme right of the Prussian position. Here is Brie, where you can find the mill. Well, you can't find it there anymore, but there is a location that is called the Rue de Moulin from the old windmill there. And then this is Ligny. So Ligny is the center. Prussian 3rd Division is deployed in this section here between Saint-Bref and Tongres, and very little fighting happens here in the grand scheme of things. Napoleon effectively turns Saint-Amand and Ligny into the sort of the bleed position. His idea is to suck Blucher's reserves into a fight for Ligny and break them. That's the plan. So the footage that is about to pop on your screens now is from just north of Saint-Amand. So it's panning from the French position over towards the Prussian high ground, which is where the reserves were positioned. Now, just like Quatre, it takes a while for Ligny to kick off, right, Liam? It's not until about 3 o'clock that the attacks on Saint-Amand begin. You've got Le Fol's 8th Division that's sent in to attack Saint-Amand. So the shot has now changed to just south of Saint-Amand, kind of following Le Fol's route in. And Girard's 7th Division is ordered to take the surrounding settlements. Now, Girard is in dress uniform, Liam, which I always kind of have mixed feelings about. One, yes, it's incredibly brave, and it serves as a point of inspiration. On the other hand, you make yourself a target. And I do wonder how the troops feel about that. Is it something that's respected, or is it something that's kind of viewed as a little bit daft, sir? You know, would you mind just kind of not making a big sign and saying, here, shoot me, because actually if they miss you, they might hit me, sir, and I'm not too keen on that. What's the troop mentality, do you think?
I mean, I think in a modern context, it would look incredibly strange and would be extremely worried if someone turned up on a modern battlefield in sort of modern dress uniform or state ceremonial uniform. But I wonder how much of it's akin to sort of naval warfare at the time, that kind of question of honor, of chivalry. You know, I'm gonna wear my best in honor of my men and in honor of the enemy to do the enemy honor. And I actually think that the soldiers at the time, I mean, you've got to think of the methods of lethality that we're talking about here. You know, high proportion of smoothbore weaponry. Yes, they are accurate to a point, but you know, clearly not as accurate as firearms develop through the 19th century. And actually, I think the troops would see it as a as a almost again like a point of honor, like our leader has turned up and he means business. You know, I've often thought the opposite almost of Picton with his division. He turns up in his top hat and his coat. Like, it's almost a little bit like, can't be bothered getting dressed, can we, sir? Like, you know what I mean? I feel it's almost disrespectful, because clearly the rank and file and probably anyone down from battalion commander, if they did the same, they'd be getting chewed out massively. So I see it as a point of honor and a point of respect, and I like to think that the troops felt that way too.
Yeah, it's a really good point that you make. Actually, if the tables had been turned and the rank and file were doing it, you'd be, certainly pulled before a court martial with the question, where the hell are your regimental necessaries? Have you sold your coat, you scoundrel? And how many lashes am I going to give you accordingly? So that's an interesting one. Although there's a question about to what extent does Picton follow in the Wellington tradition, in the sense that Wellington has that blue frock coat that he wears, becomes quite ubiquitous. Or maybe Picton's just being Picton and going, well, I'm the general, so I can do what I like. I'm not the greatest fan of Picton, brave guy, but otherwise, there are problems with many aspects of how he chose to conduct himself. So 4 o'clock, actually, no, before we get to that, confusingly, it's not just Girard who's involved. There's also a Gerard. Now, Gerard commands 3rd Corps. Girard commands 7th Division, which is in 2nd Corps. So there's your 2 pointers in terms of that, folks. So as those attacks are going in at Saint-Amand, you've also got the 12th Division of 3rd Corps being sent in at Ligny. Ligny effectively burns over the course of this battlefield. It is devastated. To this day, there are only 3 buildings that survive from that period: the Ferme d'Enhaut, the Ferme d'Ambasse, and the third one escapes me. But what it means is that there's very little in the modern town that remains. And in the years that follow, Ligny is devastated. There is famine in the region because of the damage that is done to the town. And the fight for Ligny ebbs and flows over the course of the day. The Prussians do not give ground easily. They fight with incredible tenacity. And so you have this kind of ebbing and flowing as reinforcements are sent in by both sides. By 4 p.m., there's a big Prussian counterattack, which retakes a lot of the lost ground at Saint-Amand, and Girard is mortally wounded. So whether or not that's the result of actually taking fire from the aimed shot or not, well, we, as Liam has explained, can never really know. Then at 6:30, Napoleon is ready for his big hammer blow, which is the arrival of the Imperial Guard assault. But it's not the Imperial Guard assault. The plan is for one kind of final assault on the town of Ligny itself. But Derlon, who's been summoned by Napoleon, arrives in a suspicious location. He kind of arrives in the French left rear, which isn't where people are expecting him. They're expecting him to arrive in the Prussian rear. And so there's a lot of kind of concern about, who are these troops? Because, of course, they don't have radio communications. They can't sort of ring up Derlon and go, oi, mate, where you're coming from? Is that you I can see on the horizon, kind of thing? And as a result of that attack not only has to be paused, because Napoleon can't afford to commit reserves to a push in at Ligny if he's got to fend off these Prussian reinforcements. Perhaps it's Wellington, nobody knows. And so that creates a delay. That gives the Prussians breathing space. It also creates a bit of uncertainty amongst the French. They begin to sort of shake a little bit. And Blucher tries to capitalize this with a counterattack. There are 30 infantry battalions in the western part of the battlefield on the Prussian side by this point. The counterattack fails. Meanwhile, Derlon is summoned back. Napoleon is pretty seething at this point, and at 8 o'clock orders in the Imperial Guard, pretty much as the heavens open in this monumental thunderstorm. And the Imperial Guard break through and push on out of Ligny towards the high ground beyond. Blucher very bravely personally leads forward a cavalry attack to try and buy his troops time to pull back. He recognizes the battle's over. His horse is shot from under him, which creates all kinds of problems for the Prussian High Command in terms of, okay, so now what are we going to do? Gneisenau, the chief of staff, takes one look at the situation and basically says, well, we're following Blucher's orders. Blucher's would have wanted us to pull back towards Wavre. That's what we're doing. And that keeps the campaign alive because it means that Wellington and Blucher's armies stay in contact with each other and can support each other on the 18th of June. And it also, Blucher is then rescued by one of his staff. They hail down a passing trooper. Blucher gets on the trooper's horse and rides off to receive a treatment of rhubarb and gin, which I find interesting. I'm not sure about the medicinal properties, but that's for a debate for another time. So that brings us up to date, more or less, folks. At this point, I do want to bring in our first guest because we are very fortunate to be joined by Dr. Graham Callister from York St John University. Graham is the author of a fantastic book on the attack of Derlon's Corps at Waterloo. It's called Waterloo, the Attack of First Corps. It's available from Pen and Sword. Graham is also the chair of the Napoleonic and Revolutionary War Graves charity. So it gives me a perfect opportunity to say once again, like the stream. If we get to 200 likes, I will double that amount and donate the amount to the NRWGC. And we've had a commitment from Jonathan, who is also going to double that. So there's lots of money potentially going to a very valuable cause, folks. Even if we don't make that total, for every like we get, we will donate £1. So please keep liking the stream. Last time I checked, we were up to about 40. Make it 50. Make it 100. Whatever. Make it as many as you like. Tell your friends. Get everybody liking this stream, please. Graham, welcome. Thanks for joining us. Let's start with the men in Derlon's Corps before we talk about the attack itself. How experienced were these guys?
Hi. Thanks for having me on. So Derlon's Corps is quite an experienced unit by 1815. We can probably say the French army of 1815 is the most experienced that Napoleon's had since Russia in 1812. If we look at the service history of these men, only around 1%, so 1 in every 100, had less than a year's service. And only around 5%, so 1 in every 20, had not fought on active service before before Napoleon's first abdication. So 95% of these men are veterans. They have fought previous campaigns, and the vast majority have seen major battles before. The median year of enrollment is 1812, which means that half of all soldiers had joined the army in 1812 or earlier. There are slight variations between units, but not a huge amount. Now, by 1815, these aren't necessarily the mustachioed heroes of Austerlitz anymore. Around 1% of the army, 1 in 100, had actually been in service before 1800. Fewer than 1 in 10 had actually been in service for a decade. And some of those had actually spent their time as prisoners of war mostly. So then they're not, the really, really experienced soldiers that Napoleon had maybe before 1812. But they have fought before. They know what they're doing. But a major issue for this force is less the overall experience of the men and even the officers, but more their cohesion. So in 1814, the army gets slimmed down, battalions and regiments are merged, older soldiers are pensioned off, and these mergers have left the regiments with men and officers who barely know each other. The return of some of the old soldiers in 1815 exacerbates this general problem as well. So on paper, this is a pretty experienced force, albeit that only half of them have really experienced victory. The rest have really just experienced the years of defeat, 1812 to 14. But the real issue with the force is one of cohesion throughout the Corps, which perhaps makes them a bit more brittle than their paper record would indicate.
Graham, thanks for joining us, and thanks so much for your kind words on X earlier. I won't dwell too much on that, but I'll message you directly. But going back to one of the things we talked about earlier was the sort of hands-off approach to a certain extent that Napoleon demonstrated, certainly later in the day. I wonder if you could talk us through Napoleon's vision for this attack. We sort of hear a lot about Derlon. But what's Napoleon's vision for this going forward?
Yeah, so this attack is the one that Napoleon actually plans in the day. No, he issues his orders relatively early in the morning, mid-morning, and the attack by Derlon's corps is the one that he plans. No, maybe Derlon's in charge of the tactical evolutions, but this is Napoleon's baby. And the idea here is basically that he can see that Wellington's line is imbalanced. Wellington is expecting Blucher to turn up on his left, and so he's left far fewer troops there than in his centre and right. He's only got 6 brigades of infantry, 3 of cavalry on that kind of centre-left area. Napoleon's seen this, and so he decides he's going to put a hammer blow in to smash Wellington's left, cut him off from the Prussians, preferably cut him off from Brussels. So basically what he decides to do initially is hook right round Wellington's left. He wants to send infantry through the area around Papelotte, La Haye, those kind of settlements there, cut Wellington off from Blucher, but then decides that actually that broken ground is too difficult. So instead, he decides that what he's going to do is send the divisions of First Corps in against Wellington's left from the centre. So hitting La Haye-Sainte first, and then with the divisions kind of fanning outwards, smashing into Wellington's line, one after the other in echelon. The attack essentially is aiming for Mont-Saint-Jean, maybe the farmhouse, maybe the village. It's not entirely clear, but his orders say Mont-Saint-Jean. And what that would do is rip the Allied army in half and cut Wellington off from a retreat to Brussels. It would push him to the far side of the road, away from Blucher, away from support, and gives Napoleon the most flexibility to deal in detail with these two forces. So even if Blucher comes over the horizon, Wellington isn't there to be supported anymore. And this is actually not a bad plan. So what he's going to do is launch a huge artillery barrage to start with. 3 batteries of 12-pounders, the divisional artillery of 6-pounders of First Corps, and probably 2 or 3 batteries of guard artillery, but it's never sure or not certain in the primary sources whether they engage. But this massive artillery will soften up the Allied lines. And then First Corps' 4 divisions are going to attack one after the other. First Corps nearest the road, First Division nearest the road, fanning out to 4th Division on the French right. And then they're going to come in massive columns, basically huge hammers that will smash what Napoleon really assumes is a pretty fragile Allied army.
Graham, we're just bringing up on screen now some footage of that attack. There's a lot of confusion over the formation that's used in this part of the battlefield. What do we know about the formation, and where has this confusion come from?
Well, I'll start there with the confusion, which is a common problem for Waterloo, because we have so many contradictory accounts that it is inevitable that some confusion arises. For this particular attack, a lot of the detail in the English language comes from Seaborne's account and his models, and he models this ground that people can see on the screen right now, and the attack that goes over it. And basically where he got his information was the eyewitness testimony of hundreds of British officers. The problem is that every officer wanted his regiment to have faced a full column, to have been the one that was heroic. So suddenly we get brigades all over the place, divisions moving here, there, and everywhere to kind of give these officers what they're saying happened. A lot of the early French accounts also don't really record what for them was maybe a quite mundane detail of the formation. So in early accounts, we get quite a bit of confusion. But what we think basically happens is that the divisions of First Corps each form up, 1st to 4th Division from left to right, and each one adopts what's called a column of division by battalion. So each battalion lines up in 3 ranks, with a frontage of maybe 200 men in 3 ranks, and the division's battalions are stacked one behind the other, so 8 or 9 battalions deep in the division. 2nd Division has 9 battalions, the others have 8. 4th Division actually leaves 1 regiment behind to watch its flanks, so probably only has 6 battalions. And at some point, 1st Division's brigades separate, so one attacks La Haye-Sainte, one attacks the ridge. Basically, they've got these massive blocks of men, 200 men wide, 24 ranks deep, and each of them will probably make up 100 to 120 meters of width, 75 to 100 meters of depth, and they will advance, as I say, over this ground that you can see on the screen. Huge blocks of men, 4 of them going into this space. 1st Division setting off first, and the others moving off at intervals of about 5 minutes apart in an echelon attack.
Now, Graham, Derlon's attack is ultimately shattered by the charge of 2 brigades of British heavy cavalry, which itself ends up being broken after ignoring the recall, overextending and getting cut off. How much of that is due to what Wellington described as the habit of British cavalry, and I think particularly heavies actually, had of galloping at everything?
Yeah, I mean, first, it's worth noting this cavalry charge is a spectacular success. It does rout a couple of divisions. It overruns 3 batteries of guns. It smashes a brigade of cuirassiers. But even as the charge's momentum is kind of ebbing, as the horses are getting a bit more tired, let's not forget this valley is still full of Frenchmen, full of infantry, the odd cuirassier knocking around, some artillerymen still running away, and the cavalry are kind of operating amidst all of these French soldiers. So to some extent, continuing the charge, keeping that French panic going, keeping the French fleeing is not actually that bad an idea. But the British cavalry do get carried away. Part of this is indiscipline. And this begins at the top, not necessarily with the brigade commanders, but certainly with the regiment commanders. Colonel Hamilton of the Scots Greys, for example, was seen and heard ignoring his brigade commander's attempts to rally and screaming for his men to charge onto Paris. So any men who had stopped suddenly started following their colonel. But let's remember as well, this is the regiment's first charge in the entire Napoleonic Wars. They haven't seen action since 1795. So he and his men are desperate to make their mark, and that they just want to, carry on fighting. More widely, there is an issue here of British cavalry doctrine, which is kind of partly responsible. Recruits in the British cavalry are taught rough riding rather than slow maneuver. They were taught to drop the reins and focus on fighting when in combat, and that perhaps contributes to horses just kind of keeping going as essentially pack animals in a charge. So, there are a few factors going on here. Another major factor, though, a major fault maybe, is the lack of a reserve. So, when the cavalry is charged, it needs something to rally on. There's no hub for it to come back to. The 2 reserve regiments in these heavy brigades, the Scots Greys and the Royal Horse Guards, had both charged into the fray, probably without orders. So there's just no reserve. The Dutch Belgians and Vandeleurs light dragoons aren't brought forward in time, which is probably Uxbridge's fault because he's with the charge. He's not behind. So there's a real mix of factors here. Part of it is that indiscipline. It is Wellington's galloping at everything. But there's a whole range of factors, I think, that lead the British to overextend and then allow the French counterattack, which really makes a mess of some of those heavies.
Graham, one final question from me, and it's about what happens after this phase. We tend in the story to just kind of forget about Derlon and treat it as though those 18,000 men under his command fundamentally vaporize. Derlon's corps isn't totally destroyed in the course of the attack. So what do they do over the rest of the day?
Yeah, it's a really good point that, this corps is routed as a corps, but it's actually 2 of the divisions that are most affected, 1st and 3rd Division. Probably 5,000 men across the corps are lost in this attack. It is a major blow, but they do rally. 2nd and 4th Divisions rally in relatively quick time. 1st and 3rd take a bit longer. But we see 2nd Division pretty quickly, within an hour maybe, creeping forward and beginning to skirmish around La Haye-Sainte. And it's eventually 2nd Division who do break in and capture this from the King's German Legion garrison. The 13th Light Infantry kind of at the forefront of that charge with the 17th Line. On the right, 4th Division hadn't been engaged a huge amount. That was the only one that didn't really make it to the Allied ridgeline. The cavalry charge broke the corps before that. And they kind of pivot towards the outlying farmhouses and settlements of Papelotte, La Haye, Hougoumont. And the reason they're doing that is that they're trying to create a bulwark against the Prussians for when they arrive. And they ultimately make some good progress. They do begin pushing Saxe-Weimar's men back, and they've got a foothold on that side of the battlefield by the late afternoon. The remaining infantry of the corps are heavily involved later, skirmishing with Allied troops in Wellington Centre, and they are pushed forward to support the Guard, along with the remaining artillery of the corps as well. They don't make a kind of earnest all-out attack on the Allied lines, but they do put heavy pressure on them. So, the remaining 10,000 men or so of First Corps who are still in good order after this attack early in the day, they do play their part later in the battle as well.
I'll jump in because Zach's currently on mute. So thank you very much for that, Graham. Really interesting. And if you haven't bought his book, folks, then please do go and get it because it is excellent. A great comment there from David Maxwell. Thank you so much. Love the book, Graham.
Thanks, David. Thanks very much. And thanks for having me on. Good luck with the rest of the battle. I look forward to seeing how it pans out.
Spoiler alert, somebody's going to lose. We'll let you decide, folks, quite who you think. Graham Callister from York St John University, author of Waterloo, The Attack of First Corps. Thanks very much for joining us. So, folks, we're going to go straight from one interview into another because we are joined by another very dear friend of the show, another partner in crime on the podcast. Dr. Luke Reynolds is joining us. Author, as his little thing at the bottom there says, of Who Owned Waterloo. Luke is an expert on the memory of Waterloo and lectures, as you're about to hear, over in the United States. And Who Owned Waterloo is an award-winning publication that we would thoroughly recommend. Luke, I'm going to dive straight in with one of the oddities, one of the unusual things that comes out of the Waterloo campaign, and something that is very popular amongst collectors. That's the Waterloo Medal. It's the first campaign medal issued to all ranks of the British Army. Mm-hmm. So that begs the question, how does it come about? But also, how symbolic was it in practical terms?
Well, first of all, greetings, Zach and Liam. It's good to have the Three Musketeers back together after the last Waterloo Live that we did. As you say, the Waterloo Campaign Medal is the first campaign medal issued to the British Army as we would recognize a modern campaign medal. It comes about for two reasons, and it's fundamentally two egos. The Duke of Wellington thinks that it's a damn good idea, and actually is the one who suggests it in the first place. And what he says in late June, early July of 1815 kind of goes. And the other is the Prince Regent, because the Prince Regent suddenly has the opportunity to have a medal with his head on it. He's been spending money with his father's head on it for years, and he wants his own. And he's going to get it eventually, but he starts out with this medal. So it's both of them working in collaboration to create this first campaign medal, and it is deeply symbolic. It actually plays a significant part in the sort of the people's psyche of making Waterloo overshadow the rest of the war. Because you have people that fought from 1808 to 1814 constantly, that faced almost every French marshal that was put down into Spain and Portugal, but who were not at Waterloo, because when that peace was signed in 1814, that army was broken up. Some of it was sent to the United States, some of it was sent to India. A lot of it was in mid-transit when Napoleon shows back up again. And so you have these regiments that have fought for 6 years who aren't at Waterloo and who are bare-chested. They don't get a medal. While those who were at Waterloo, even if it's their first battle, and it's the first battle for a lot of those soldiers, they have this medal that shows off that they were there. It's going to take decades for that imbalance to be corrected with the Military General Service Medal. To give you some idea of how long we're talking about, by that point, it's not the Prince Regent's head on it. It's not even George IV's head on it. It's not even George IV's brother. It's Victoria's head that goes on the Military General Service Medal. It takes that long.
Luke, great to see you, and thanks for joining us. I want to sort of switch fires slightly here and look at, I think, what is one of the big problems with the way the story of Waterloo has been historically been retooled, and that's the downplaying of the Prussians. Now, you know, we talk about Wellington's role in instigating this medal, but how much of a role did he play in this downplaying of the Prussians?
A significant one, Liam. He's fully aware that, you know, as he builds this reputation, that Waterloo is his crowning achievement, and he's going to have more elevation if he sort of pushes Blucher to the side a little bit more and a little bit more. He's also fully aware, I mean, he's playing the long game. He's fully aware that he's going to outlive Blucher unless something happens, right? Blucher is older. And so Wellington starts this campaign. Now, we talk a lot about the Waterloo Dispatch and all of that, where he does mention the Prussians. And that's partially because the man is shook up, right? He's never seen a field like this. And it's also because he's fully aware that he still needs the Prussians. There's diplomacy going on here. And Wellington, for all that he had an ego, was also a damn good person at a diplomatic table. So he knows what he's doing. But once that alliance starts to sort of calm down or even fracture, depending on how you want to see it, he has no problem in pushing the Prussians to the side. It starts almost immediately. When Waterloo Bridge is opened in 1817, yes, the Prussian flag is there. Yes, the orange flag is there, but they're overwhelmingly outnumbered by Union flags, by English flags, Welsh flags, Scottish flags, Irish flags, everything that emphasizes that this was the Union that beat this, not the American Union. I know my accent is confusing. The British Union, and we see this in a couple of ways, right? Wellington helps commission a guy named Peenman to do a group portrait at the Battle of Waterloo. The thing is massive. It's in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. I highly recommend anyone who visits sees the thing, because you really don't understand how big it is until you see it in person. It's at the end of the battle. It's over. That painting has British, Scottish, Irish, Welsh, Dutch, King's German Legion, and even French prisoners in it. It doesn't have a single Prussian in the whole thing, right? So from that point on, he's pushing them out, and he's going to, in his own way, patronize those places and those stories that elevate the British narrative above the Prussians.
Luke, I'm really struck by what you're saying here, but I'm going to focus on something that Graham picked up in the previous interview, which was Cyborn, because in the National Army Museum there is this spectacular diorama that folks who've been to the National Army Museum in London will remember, and it's the Cyborn model of Waterloo. And there's a lot of controversy surrounding this, and an element of personal tragedy as well, I would say. So talk us through how this is received at the time and what its significance is for how Waterloo was remembered.
So Cyborn's model is originally commissioned by Daddy Hill, Viscount Hill, when he's commander-in-chief of the British Army. And he commissions it as sort of an education tool, partially for the officers and men of the British Army, and partially for the general British populace. Cyborn at this point he's an officer. He doesn't get commissioned in time to fight at Waterloo, but he does spend 2 years in the Army of Occupation, where he develops a huge passion for surveying, old school map making, things like that. And he's actually written 2 books on surveying, basically instruction manuals. By the time Hill, very reasonably, looks at him and goes, all right, underemployed British officer, can survey well, let's have this chap make the model. So Cyborn goes to La Haye-Sainte. He lives there for 8 months, which is something that everyone who's a fan of this battle wishes they could do now. And he surveys the entire field, literally inch by inch. He gets home and he writes to almost every British officer that's still alive. He creates basically what we would consider a fill-in form of sort of, here's my experiences, here's what's going on. And he gets hundreds of these back, right? It's still the largest archive of eyewitness testimony that we have on the Battle of Waterloo in the English language. Now, as Graham pointed out, the problem is that everyone wants their regiment to be in the special place. But overall, if you put them all together, and Zach, you and I know this, and Liam knows this, and our listeners know this, that's the whole point. Every eyewitness is going to be slightly flawed, but if you aggregate them enough, you get an idea of what's going on. And that's what he does. He decides to build this vast model. It's got one tin soldier or lead soldier for every 2 men at that battlefield. So you have a huge number of figurines on this thing. And he sets it at 7 p.m., which you guys haven't gotten to yet, but spoiler alert, is one of the one of the crisis moments of a battle that is arguably entirely made up of crisis moments. It's the moment when the French Imperial Guard crest the ridge. They're turned away. But by that point, the Prussians have also overrun Papelotte, right? They are moving in. They are threatening. They're on the battlefield. They are already the hammer to Wellington's allies Anvil, and the poor French are stuck in the middle of it. And that's where the problem is, because Cyborn creates an accurate model. And while the average person doesn't really know enough to care, a huge number of British army, led by Wellington, basically say, this is wrong. Kincaid, Captain John Kincaid, wrote 2 books about Waterloo and his experiences in the Rifle Corps. Famously said, it's an excellent quote, comment there. Basically wrote to Cyborn and basically said, your model gives a power equal share of the glory when they did not experience equal share of the conflict. And that's the view. And Wellington never goes. He refuses to see the model. He refuses to support the model. The problem is that in the middle of all this, as Cyborn is building this model, the Great Reform Act comes in. Now, the Great Reform Act is a significant moment, and it is a positive, overwhelmingly, for Britain. But it does Cyborn dirty, because the liberal government that comes in doesn't feel like spending large amounts of money on the military. And the model is one of the first things to get cut. So he loses the funding. He's got to do it himself. And when you combine that with Wellington basically saying, I'm not seeing this thing, and the people and general populace going, well, if Wellington refuses to see it, it can't be accurate. You end up with this 39 square foot millstone around Cyborn's neck.
Now, Luke, you talked about there that model, was partly created for the public. And how is Waterloo, how is that story then told around the world as the British Empire expands, throughout the 19th century? You mentioned Victoria issuing the General Service Medal. Now, clearly these things are still important to people at this time, but how is Waterloo in particular sort of remembered?
Waterloo becomes a lightning rod. Now, it becomes a lightning rod for a lot of things. There's a lot of controversy that comes in, right? The reformers, the radicals are going there. But across the empire, Waterloo becomes one of those moments and one of those names where you can take an aggregate colonial population, right? Say somewhere like Australia, where you have people that are that came in as tin miners or gold miners. You have people that came in as cattle farmers. You have people that come in because they can afford to buy 1,200 acres of land. And yes, inevitably you have insert convict joke here. You have people from across all 4 nations that represent the British Isles and a lot of other Europeans as well. And Waterloo becomes one of those moments where you can remind everybody that you're all British. And crucially, reading between the lines, you're all white, right? You're all European. And it allows the building of a British national identity that overlays a Scottish, an Irish, a Welsh. The best way I've ever found to describe it is, you go to high school, you go to college with hundreds of people. And there are people that you will hate, people that you will love, but most of the people you're never really going to talk to that much. But if you run into someone 10, 20 years down the line in a different country that went to your school, that was in your class, even if you weren't friends with them, you're probably going to have a drink with them because you've got that connection. Waterloo provides a British version of that.
Luke, unfortunately, we're going to have to cut you short there. As fans of the podcast will know, we could talk to you for hours about this and have done on the show. So if you want to hear more from Luke, please do check out our back catalogue on the Napoleonic Wars podcast. But for the moment, Dr. Luke Reynolds, author of Who Owned Waterloo, thank you so much for joining us here on Waterloo Live.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you both for doing this. And please support the NRWGC. As a trustee of it as well, I'm completely unbiased in this.
Thanks very much there to Luke. And it's a good point at which we can just reiterate that plug, folks, that for every like that this stream gets, we are donating £1 to the NRWGC. And if we reach 200 likes on the stream, we will double whatever the final total is. We're currently at somewhere around 55, which means we've got a bit of a way to go, but we're still on air for another couple of hours. So there's still time, folks, but please do your bit, share the stream, like the stream. And if you're enjoying this content, bear in mind that if you subscribe, you can find more content like this. But we're going to turn to a little bit of an update because, as you've been hearing, La Haye-Saint is at the focal point of a crisis at this moment of the battle. Now, La Haye-Saint, as we discussed at the start of the stream, is one of 3 forward positions that Wellington occupies. This particular farmhouse is occupied by men of the King's German Legion, specifically the 2nd Light KGL, under the command of Major George Baring. Now, at 5 o'clock, when we came on air, the barn itself had been set alight. The gate hadn't existed for the entirety of the day, the reason being it had been destroyed the night before. The troops hadn't known they were about to fight a battle the following day. They needed firewood. It was a wet night. They wanted to dry out. And so they hacked down the gate, which is something that I imagine they might have regretted the following morning when they were told, no, you need to defend this place. A nice gate might have helped substantially with that. Now, for much of the day, there's a struggle for these guys, and it's not so much in terms of numbers, it's in terms of ammunition. They don't have enough ammunition to go around because they face essentially 3 attacks over the course of this. And it's a testament to their hardiness and their bravery that they will fire every single round that they can find and then fight their way out with bayonets. There's no preemptive withdrawal. Let's keep a few rounds in the pocket and see if we can kind of use them to fight our way out. They fire everything. They strip cartridges from their dead comrades, and then they fight their way out with bayonets. And when they muster back on the ridge, they've suffered 90% casualties. Just consider that. 9 out of every 10 men either killed, wounded, missing, or a prisoner of war. Now, between 5 and 5:30, so from the time when we first came on air, they did get some reinforcements in the form of some Nassauers. And again, this emphasizes how Wellington was prepared to trust these 4 positions to a multinational force. In some respects, he doesn't have a choice. He doesn't have the British troops to go around. Am I right, Liam? Because if we think about that deployment structure, he puts his Peninsular Division, his most experienced troops, kind of in that left wing of the army, so to the east of the highway, and kind of uses them to prop them up. So really, when it comes to defending these 4 positions, you've got to make use of that multinational element.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's diplomatic in the sense that he needs to show that he is committed to supporting his multinational army, right? Like, if all he does is rely on British troops and sort of marginalizes the sort of Dutch, Belgian, the other allies, it's not going to look good afterwards, particularly if things go badly. But also, you talk about that sort of the propping them up. Wellington was keen to have dare I say, greener troops from different nations. Bearing in mind, there's still quite a lot of green troops in redcoats as well. And he's using that kind of that mix to, I guess, mutually support each other, right? He's using mixed brigades or certainly brigades, neighboring brigades that are mixed in order to sort of gain a bit of strength from each other, I think.
Yeah, I mean, that trust element ends up being really key, but also, like, these guys have got a job to do. And I think that's one of the things that comes through very strongly from this. For all the concerns about all these guys have served in the French army in some cases, obviously not in the case of the KGL, but the Dutch Belgians, they fight hard, and they're going to be key to defeating the Imperial Guard, as we're going to discover in about an hour's time. Now, the farm faces a third assault at 6 p.m, so that assault has kind of petered out by now, and the farm has literally fallen as we're talking through this. And the Prince of Orange, again, is going to rear his head at this point. We've talked before about Orange at Quatre. He'd ordered the 2nd Battalion 69th to form into line just as they get hit by cuirassiers. Now, seeing La Haye-Saint thoroughly pushed by the French, I'm trying to remember which division is involved in this attack. It will be one of Derlon's divisions, I believe, that's involved in it. He orders forward the 5th and 8th King's German Legion line battalions to try and sweep away this French assault. Now, that sounds great, except that there are cavalry lurking in some dead ground. Now, we can't know that dead ground and what it looked like, because that section of the battlefield from the Lion's Mound to the main highway and down as far as the Haysant has basically been scooped up and stuck into what is now the Lion's Mound. So we don't know the contours to be able to assess this, but the 8th KGL line basically get mauled by cuirassiers. The 5th managed to form square and pull back. Now, that's a moment in time, and you can start pinning and apportioning blame or not. Where Orange, for me, really gets or should be put through the ringer is over what happens next. Liam, do you want to talk us through that next phase?
Yeah, indeed. And actually, I think this is probably one of the most emotional parts of the battle for me. Actually, it's just so poignant. So like you say, the 5th managed to form square and pull back in some semblance of order. Clearly these guys have seen their compatriots in the 8th take a bit of a beating. Now they withdraw back to the ridge. Orange decides that no, we are going to send we're going to send relief to La Haye-Sainte. Omteda, take your men forward. Omteda's not particularly keen. He says, look, there is cavalry in the dead ground. If you do this, it's going to end badly for us. We should be forming square and potentially advancing in square. Let's be honest, it's doable. But he says that it's not a good idea. Anyway, the Orange basically turns around and says, look, if you don't do it, I will find someone who will. In which case, again, we talked about honor a few times already. Omteda doesn't want to let the side down, doesn't want to be disgraced. So he says, right, fine, no worries. I'll lead the 5th forward. And predictably, as Omteda had foreseen, they are absolutely decimated by cuirassiers that, like you say, were lurking in that dead ground, probably just off to the sort of west and south slightly, I think. If you look at the contours today, you're right. You can't really tell, but it looks that direction. And Omteda's last seen fighting for his life in the garden, and his body is later recovered. And it's just such a loss of life. The 5th KGL line are almost decimated to a man, aren't they? And it's one of those sort of microcosms of the futility of war and just people trying to make a name and trying to prove themselves, sort of, toxic masculinity on show in spades. And it could have been avoided, I think, sadly, and it was completely futile to start with.
It was. You can understand the desire to step in and do something helpful from Orange's part. If you look at where his command is on a map of Waterloo, what you find is that basically they're everywhere. And there is a lot of speculation, and I'm a bit of a cynic when it comes to this. But incidentally, a lot of historians tend to agree with me and be similarly cynical about this. It kind of looks as though Wellington basically strung out Orange's command, so he couldn't really command in any particular part of the battlefield. The entirety, effectively, of the Allied front line at Waterloo consists of Orange's corps on a front that's about 3 kilometers, maybe 3.5 kilometers wide. What that means is that Orange shouldn't be able to go to any one place and do any significant damage. But this is significant. 2nd King's German Legion Light Battalion, the 5th and the 8th Line Battalions. These are veteran units because Wellington needs veteran units, and that's why they're in that part of the battlefield. They are forming a key part of the line, and with them gone, the line has to be plugged with Lambert's brigade. So many folks will have heard of the 27th Inniskillings, who form square just to the east of the crossroads. Today there's a memorial on the spot, and they stand there. Now, because La Haye-Sainte has fallen, the French are able to move up artillery so that they are very close to the Allied ridge, which therefore means as the Inniskillings are stood there in square, they are taking an absolute pounding. So severe is this pounding that at one point, one of the officers rides over, and it's quite a junior officer, I believe. It's something like a captain. And this is the guy who is now in command of the regiment because the other senior officers have been killed. And he basically says, I've got so few officers left that I'm letting the sergeants command companies. And the commander of the regiment that he speaks to says, well, do you want us to lend you some officers so you've got some officers in command? And I think this says a lot about kind of regimental loyalties and the camaraderie within units, the captain says, "No, it's all right. I'm loath to deprive these sergeants of the opportunity to command their men." Now, it sounds like quite a modern concept, actually, that, I'm going to take the guys who have the experience with these guys, I'm going to give them that opportunity to lead. It's not something you necessarily associate with the attitudes of most officers, particularly in an age of aristocracy and aristocratic officers. It's not necessarily what you associate. So I think it gives us an insight really into how, particularly the 27th, must have worked in terms of that relationship between officer and certainly NCO. And the most staggering part of this story is that the 27th hold. Right now, 210 years ago, they are being pounded by French artillery, and they hold. They stand and they die in that square. They take 68% casualties, but they do not buckle. They basically hold that part of Wellington's line at this precise moment, 210 years ago, in order to make sure that the line holds. It's a staggering sacrifice. And I think it really brings home the importance of what we're trying to do this evening in terms of telling these stories and remembering the extraordinary feats of some of these guys, because that is heroism. Whatever you might think of the period, whatever you might think of the individuals involved, to stand there and do your duty and stand with your colleagues and friends as they're being shot to pieces is an incredible thing for any human being to do under any circumstance.
Yeah, it's huge, isn't it? I think we just don't. It's so difficult for us to grasp the nature of warfare in this period visually. We see it in film and stuff like that, but everything that's coming at these guys on both sides of all nations is visible to them. They can see it coming. Generally, there's obviously the argument of artillery on the reverse slope, but it is killing on an industrial scale when you can see the person you are, you can see them, you can look them in the eye, and the emotion, I think, that just kind of gets skipped over, particularly for something like the 27th. That's an excellent story about the sergeants commanding companies. I think it also talks about the narrowing of that gap, of that class gap in battle. When you're being absolutely hammered by shot and shell, it doesn't matter how much money your dad's got in the bank, right? We need people to stand up, and we need people to take charge and to look after this battalion. And I think that's a huge indication of just how desperate things were for the Enniskillens.
We've got a few comments coming in, folks. Please do keep commenting, posting your questions. We'll endeavour to answer as many as we can over the course of the evening. And as I keep saying, like the stream so that you can support the NRWGC for nothing. Alternatively, please just go and donate direct. Like if you'd like to donate, £2, £5, £10, maybe more, please do go and do that, folks. The link is ticking across the bottom of the screen, nrwgc.com/donate. Graham is continuing to join us, even post-interview, and says the story of Ompteder's nephews makes his fate all the more poignant, although some have said that Alton gave the order, Orange just refused to overrule it. And yeah, so this is the story that Ompteder has his nephew with him, quite a young nephew. We're not talking sort of a grown lad. And he leaves that nephew in the care of a brother officer in order to lead his unit forward personally. Now, there's a question mark over whether or not Ompteder needed to command personally and lead that unit forward personally, because he's in command of the brigade. So he could have probably let somebody else take the 5th line forward. But as you're saying, Liam, that honor element just wouldn't have allowed him to do that. So thank you for that, Graham. Mark Trowbridge, been dipping in and out since the start. Just wanted to say thank you. He's from Teesside, so apparently your neck of the woods there, Liam. And then Skip Smoyer is talking about another show on YouTube, the Waterloo podcast. We do like to spread the love here on the channel. He says that the Waterloo podcast have been reviewing British units one by one and going over prior experience, make of where the troops came from and what happens to some long after. And we're going to be covering a little bit more of that in a general sense when we interview Evan Wilson at 8 o'clock tonight. So more to look forward to. So please keep those comments and questions coming in, folks. We are now going to turn to another portion of the battlefield. We're going to Plancenoit. Now, let me just refresh your memories in terms of where that is on the battlefield as I bring up our satellite imagery. So if we come out, this is the area of campaign. You can see Ligny and Quatre, and then Plancenoit is here. So if you imagine that the French are engaging Wellington's army in the top, the area in the top of your picture, Plancenoit is in the right rear. If the Prussians can push through at Plancenoit, it enables them to push on to the main highway that leads back to Paris. That will basically cut the French line of communications, and then they can encircle Napoleon's army, destroying it in detail. So you can see the vision and why Plancenoit ends up being so important. Now, because it's the Prussian sector of the battlefield, and it is a little bit out of the way, it's slightly off the beaten track for those who are just going to do the main and easily accessible sites at Waterloo, it sometimes gets a little bit missed. So what we're going to bring up now is some drone footage from Plancenoit. You can just make out the steeple on the right-hand side of shot. Now, that church isn't the church that was there at the time, but it does become a focal point for the fighting. And this is the area over which the Prussians would have advanced. So in this particular section of the field, you would have had 16th Brigade from Prussian 4th Corps. At 4:30, 15th and 16th Brigade are on the battlefield, and they're sent in far, far earlier than Blucher wants. This force is 3/4 Landwehr. And from Blucher's perspective, sure, these guys are fresher because they haven't been engaged at Ligny. They have all their ammunition. All they've had to do is a bit of marching, but they are much rawer. Effectively, when you look at the regimental distribution, there is one infantry regiment acting as a spine within each brigade, and the other 3 are Landwehr units. So you can see that, and the distribution of Landwehr to line regiments is much more pronounced in this corps than it is in others. So these are not the hardiest, they're not the veterans by any stretch of the imagination, but they are doing one of the most important jobs on the battlefield. And the reason they're sent in earlier than Blucher wants is because he takes one look at the area fundamentally in shot now. He can reach for a telescope and look at what's happening and see that the Allies are hard pressed, and he's concerned. That's the bottom line. He's not confident that Wellington's army can keep holding. So he has to take the pressure off and has to send in those 2 brigades earlier than he would have liked. Now, half an hour to an hour up the road, arriving between 5 and 5:30, are 2 more regiments. The 13th again deploys kind of in the northern section. So 13th and 15th would have been in this section of the field that the drone's traversing now. 14th is sent into Plancenoit to support the 16th. Now, these guys have been on the road since 4 a.m. It's taken a bit of a delay, partly because of the landscape, partly because of a fire that breaks out that kind of delays them. But they have been on the go for a long time before they're then thrown into this crucible. Liam, in terms of the state of these guys, at what point does adrenaline kick in, I guess? You know, when you've been on the road for 12 hours, and you're then sent into a battle, at this point, does nothing matter? And, you know, you've got a job to do, let's go. And the adrenaline takes over, or does that have an impact on your capacity to fight?
I think the guys would be suffering from fatigue of a kind that we just can't relate to. I think in terms of adrenaline, you'd probably have spikes at various points during the day. You know, those initial movements, the sight of the fire in Wavre, those sort of we're off to battle, where we're taking it to the French. Those sorts of moments that would die off as the day went on. But I think it's really important to remember at this point, they can hear the battlefield. They can hear what's happening at the ridge at Mont Saint-Jean. And every step forward, yes, I know it's broken ground and some of the ground is difficult. Every step, those guns are getting louder and louder and louder. So the sort of anticipation, and I think the anticipation would keep them going, I think. and it would take a pretty steady hand, I'd say, from officers and NCOs to sort of keep the guys in check. I mean, that they're not going to be running around like headless chickens, I wouldn't have thought, but just keep everyone on task, keep everyone focused. We keep moving, we stay together, that sort of thing. To get them to within range of the battlefield, as in within sort of deployment range of the battlefield, I mean there. And at which point, I think, like many soldiers going into battle, the kind of the feet aren't sore anymore. The pack doesn't feel heavy. It's adrenaline, and it's tactical awareness, and it's self-preservation. For officers, it's that sort of tactical, strategic, processes that are going on. So I think by the time that these guys are deployed, they're fresh as daisies.
Apologies, folks. We are live and anything can happen, and leaving myself on mute is something I've done several times already on this stream. Geraint asks, as you can see, what time does Napoleon send in the Young Guard? Great question. And funnily enough, that's exactly what I was getting to next, because it's a hard fight for these guys. Just as the Prussians capture Plancenoit, the division of the Young Guard is sent in to retake the town. That's around about now, in fact, 6:30. So we're about 20 minutes off. In terms of the timing there, in terms of that being live. But as I say, this it's a village more than a town at this point. It's a couple of streets and not much more besides. So the division of Young Guard are sent in. They retake it at 6:30. The Prussians then commit more men. Thibault-Kirsch's second division ends up arriving, and that starts to try and loop further to the south and around Plancenoit. So you've kind of got this kind of fixing the French and then trying to flank them. It's a movement that continues throughout the afternoon. And in the end, Napoleon even has to send in a couple of battalions of the Old Guard to retake the town once the Prussians are in control. So thank you for that question, Geraint. Liam, the significance of Plancenoit, is it possible to even overstate it in the grand scheme of what's happening at Waterloo?
Oh, absolutely not. I mean, it's everything, isn't it? You don't have what happens at on the ridge without what happens at Plancenoit. And yes, it's almost, I think with our hindsight heads on, it almost happens at the perfect time. It's that, I know there's infantry, but it's that cavalry arrival. It's just in time to save the day when Wellington's being so pressed with the fall of Hougoumont. But yeah, it's everything. I think it's a very different battle, and like we've said before, the whole strategy of the campaign is set on this moment.
Now, folks, we've talked about the Prussian contribution. We've talked about La Haye-Saint. I do want to talk about another of the most famous focal points of fighting, which, the bulk of the fighting is probably done for them by this point. But nonetheless, it's really important in the context of the story, and that is at Hougoumont Farm over on the western side of the battlefield. And this drone footage taken, as you can see, at dawn, actually gives you an indication of the scale of the much wider complex. All too often, people focus on the farm itself, which is understandable because that's what remains today. But in 1815, we're talking about a much bigger complex, probably about 3 times the size, particularly extending to the south. It's an old complex. It was old even before Waterloo. It had been garrisoned briefly in Marlborough's day. There are 4 gates, a lane to the north for resupply, but crucially, there's a wood to the south and an orchard to the east. So as I say, about triple the size. Now, in terms of the garrison, we tend to talk predominantly about the Coldstream Guards, who are famous for the closing of the gate of Hougoumont. The Coldstreams do like to talk about how they are the defenders of Hougoumont, and rightly so. They play a key role. But again, I just want to bring in that multinational element into the story, which I think gets pushed to the sidelines all too often, because without taking anything away from the contribution of the Coldstreams, they're not the only ones there. So initially, in terms of that garrison, you've got the light companies of 2nd Battalion 1st Guards, who are in the orchard, the light company 3rd Battalion 1st Guards, again in the orchard, light company the 2nd Battalion 2nd, i.e. the Coldstreams, in the building in the garden, light company of the 2nd Battalion 3rd Guards, that's the Scots Guards, in the lane to the west of the building. Then you've got the 1st Battalion, 2nd Nassau Infantry in the woods, the orchard, the garden, and the building. So literally strong all over the place, creating a kind of spine for that initial garrison. You've got the 1st Company of the Feldjäger Corps, which is a Hanoverian unit in the wood, and 100 men from the Lüneburg Grubhagen Light Battalion, another Hanoverian unit also in the wood. So even the initial garrison is not just a case of, look, let's just stick a battalion of guards in Hougoumont and the problem's solved. It's a big complex. It requires a lot of guys, and the guards are not initially committed in substantial numbers there. Now, that changes over the course of the day because the reinforcements that get sent in include 7 companies of the Coldstream Guards. They also include, who are deployed to the building and the garden. It also includes the entirety of the Scots Guards. And having spoken to some Scots Guards veterans, I know they do ever so slightly resent that the Coldstreams kind of annex and claim Hougoumont as their own, when they kind of feel quite rightly that they deserve some of the credit, because they do. They're in the orchard. But you've also got the 2nd Line King's German Legion and 3 light companies of King's German Legion in the orchard. You've got the Salzgitter Landwehr Battalion, Hanoverian Landwehr unit in the orchard. And you've also got the Brunswick Advance Guard Battalion, Light Battalion, and 1st Light Battalion. So this is a multinational force. Again, pointing them to what we were talking about earlier, about the multinational nature of this defense. In terms of these other guys not getting the mention, do you think part of the issue is that the guards are the guards? They've got incredible PR, and a lot of these other units kind of disappear over the course of the next 200 years.
Yeah, it's in terms of PR, the regiments of foot guards are extremely prestigious, due to their links with the British sovereign. And like you say, with the disbandment of the King's German Legion and the sort of return of sovereignty and sovereign troops back to the German states post-Napoleonic Wars, it's very easy for the foot guards to sort of just elbow themselves and kind of just wrap their big red tuniced arms around the walls of Hougoumont a little bit.
We have to say they do it incredibly well. I want to, at this point, go back to a question which was asked much earlier in the live stream about archaeology on the battlefield. And this is a great point at which to raise it. I'm just trying to find the person who mentioned it. I think it was Chris, who asked, has modern archaeology made any significant discoveries that have shifted our views of understanding the battle? Hougoumont is the ultimate example of that, Chris. Hopefully you're still with us and able to enjoy this answer. But as I play through the footage once again, we talk a lot about the break-ins, and particularly the first break-in. So the closing of the gates of Hougoumont. Wellington supposedly says that the success of Waterloo swung on the closing of the gates of Hougoumont, which I regard as sort of one of the myths. But we'll get to that in just a second, and perhaps Liam will shout at me and tell me that I'm an idiot. But what we've found through archaeology and through some very forensic, actually, analytical work in the sources is that there are multiple break-ins. One, in that section of the doorway, actually, that you can see, there is a door that leads into the complex. And as troops are escaping the chateau, of which very little remains because it burns down, all that's left is the chapel that you can see as that lonely grey slated slate roof building with the pointy bit on the top. That's the chapel. That's all that's left. As the guys garrisoning the chapel, the chateau, evacuate, they run straight into some Frenchmen who have found their way in through this door, and so they're able to mop that up very quickly. Another break-in isn't really a break-in of sorts. It's when some artillery fire ends up hitting the south gate, which is about to come into shot right now. You'll just be able to see it behind that tree over on the right-hand side of shot. There it goes. But because the French aren't expecting it, it's not an aimed shot. They're able to just reseal the gate. But crucially, by doing some archaeological work, they found that not only can they find concentrations of musket balls in terms of fire coming in, they've also found musket balls going out, which is particularly significant when they found Allied caliber musket balls, because there are different calibers for the French versus the Allied muskets. They found Allied musket balls around some of the walls on the interior of the complex, which means that at various points there have been concentrations of fire as the French have started to get over the walls and get inside the compound, and detachments have leveled their muskets and fired volleys to deal with those break-ins. So we now know that there are multiple points over the course of the battle where there are multiple break-ins and times where the French do manage to get over the walls, despite what we know about Victor Hugo's killing ground, which is another of the famous ones in the Waterloo story. But Liam, just ever so quickly, before we move on to our next segment, the closing of the gates of Hougoumont being the thing upon which the success of Waterloo swung, where do you stand on that debate?
Hougoumont important because it's there, and Wellington thinks it's important, and Napoleon thinks it's important, so it is important. I don't think necessarily the fate of Europe was hinged on those north gates. I think that had the French taken Hougoumont, you'd like to think that at least some of those troops that you detailed would have withdrawn to the ridge, and the ridge itself is still an obstacle. The broken ground to the west of the ridge is still an obstacle. There's still a lot for the French to do at this point. So I don't think it's necessarily been overplayed because Hougoumont is important, but it's let's be honest, I think it's not the battle in a nutshell, is it?
No, it's not. I always describe Hougoumont as a siege within a battle, and it's not that it's cut off, because it's not. The fact that you can get reinforcements in is significant in itself. But it is one chapter of a much wider story. And we've been talking about Derlon's attack, for example. If Derlon had managed to break through, holding Hougoumont wouldn't have been the be-all and the end-all. Historian Charles Esdale has tried to sort of make the case that even if the French had taken Hougoumont, it wouldn't have made any difference. Now, personally, I don't quite agree, because of this obstacle nature of it. And if that obstacle is prickly, that just causes you to pause tactically. And as you say, Hougoumont matters because it's there and because it does suck in the vast majority of Ray's Corps, Second Corps. This is half of the army that's deployed initially at Waterloo. So a huge proportion of that force gets sucked in. Had that not been the case, had the French taken it, then actually there might have been infantry units to spare that could have supported Ney's cavalry attacks. And I know we're getting into ifs and buts and counterfactuals, but it just kind of underlines that if Hougoumont doesn't remain garrisoned, then there are other options for the French. But that's not to say that you take that argument too far and say that it all swings on Hougoumont, because for me, with the best one in the world, it just doesn't. Folks, please keep the comments and the questions coming in. Thank you to everybody who has liked the live stream so far. I know I keep saying it. I make no apologies for doing so again. For every like that this stream gets, we will donate £1 to the Napoleonic and Revolutionary War Graves Charity, a fantastic organisation that seeks to restore veteran graves and turn them into local sites of memory, as well as burying disinterred veterans. The reason that I plug it at this point is because we are about to talk about why Waterloo matters. And you may have, if you're following sort of the charity and also our social media, you may have seen that the charity made headlines earlier this week with the cleaning of the grave of a very significant and very famous Waterloo veteran. Before I show you the outcome of that cleaning process, here's effectively one that I made earlier. Before I started that cleaning, I went to visit the grave of Sergeant William Lawrence, whose autobiography is one of the iconic and most famous accounts of the Peninsular War and the Waterloo campaign, and is incredibly visceral. Lawrence is sent to the colours eventually during the course of the battle when his battalion, the 40th, is coming under fire, and they've run out of ensigns to hold the colours. He says himself that it was a job that he didn't much like. He'd seen many men cut down over the course of the day, and he describes very graphically, actually, the fact of what happens to some of these guys around him, stood literally beside him as they get hit by French cannon fire. Now, Lawrence is one of the lucky ones. He makes it home after the war. He buys an inn and runs it with his French wife, Clotilda. But whilst I was at the grave, I shot a little segment before the cleaning began on just why Waterloo actually matters?
Sometimes people say to me, Waterloo doesn't matter. Napoleon was going to be beaten, and besides, Waterloo couldn't have happened if Napoleon hadn't failed in Russia. Both of those comments are true, and there is no doubt that the significance of Waterloo has been overstated. We can thank the British for that. They were so proud of the part that they had played in Napoleon's final defeat that the British propaganda machine went into overdrive, building hype around the battle and its impact. But that doesn't mean that the battle wasn't important. Yes, Napoleon's final defeat was coming, and for sure, whichever battle ended up being the Emperor's last was bound to go down in history. But that's exactly the point. Waterloo is partly important because it was the final chapter of the Napoleonic Wars. Not the last battle for sure. There were other smaller clashes when the Allies invaded France shortly after Waterloo, but it was Napoleon's last. And as the guns fell silent at Waterloo, it was clear that Napoleon could not hope to return to his former power, and it was only a matter of time before he had to give up, ending almost a quarter of a century of conflict for the final time. The fact that Waterloo was that battle made it mean that it does matter. But on a more human level, I'm never comfortable with the idea that a battle doesn't matter. It's very easy to look at the stories of war and get carried away with the drama, the risk, the thrill of everything hanging on a literal knife edge, and the remarkable stories of heroism and bravery that men on all sides demonstrated. Yet behind every story and every casualty statistic is a human being, and sometimes it's easy to forget the scale of the human sacrifice, the suffering, and the tragedy. Nothing brings home the human cost of war than visiting the graves of Waterloo veterans, such as this one. This is the final resting place of Sergeant William Lawrence in Studland. Lawrence had a long service record fighting with the 40th Regiment in South America during the Peninsular War before being sent to Belgium to fight Napoleon. After the war, he left an account of his experiences, which he then dictated to his family members. The experiences of men such as Lawrence deserve to be remembered as a poignant reminder of why myth-busting is so important. We owe it to them that we remember history in all its complexities, dispelling the myths and making sure that the stories of the elation, fear and pain of all nationalities at Waterloo are recorded. Lawrence was one of the lucky ones. He made it home to his native Dorset after the war, having married a French girl, Clotilda, who is buried alongside him here. Many of his comrades were not so fortunate, hastily bundled into mass graves on the battlefield with little fanfare. Our recognition of their role in a key moment in history matters. Their suffering as they fought and bled matters. Their trauma as the horrors of war haunted them for the rest of their lives matters. Their deaths in the service of their country matter. Waterloo may be one of the most famous and most misunderstood battles in history. It may have been mythologized and dramatized and molded to fit all kinds of propaganda. Yet at the heart of the story, of the grit and the gore, of the loyalty and the loss, of the service and the sacrifice, is these men's experiences. Waterloo has been remembered for 200 years and will be for 200 more because it is such a human story. And being honest with ourselves about what these men did and experienced could not be more important.
Okay, and we are back. I'm an advocate of the charity, and I think that probably comes across quite strongly there. So you saw the grave in its state before. Now allow me to give you an indication of the transformation that it has undergone. This is from a BBC News report that broke today, and you can see that remarkable transformation. So this is BBC local news, and it outlines kind of the story of not only Lawrence, but also the cleaning that we did. So it was done by a multinational team, in fact. Those of you who know the history of the period may be familiar with the work of Professor Edward Koss from the United States Command and General Staff College. He was a trustee of the NRWGC for a time. He was involved in the second stage of cleaning, and you can see a representative from a veteran of the US Army there, Command Sergeant Major Macmillan. And it was a real privilege to stand at the graveside of Lawrence and reflect on his service, and also sort of talk with particularly Ed, who's an esteemed expert in the history of this period, about that service and the experiences of these soldiers, but also to talk to Command Sergeant Major Macmillan about his experiences. And it's very striking that when I talk to people about the work of the charity, actually it's the veterans who get it most, and the veterans who feel it the most keenly. And they're often quite appalled, actually, that it's not simply dealt with in the same way that veterans of World War I and World War II are, in the sense that that coverage is universal. You know, it takes an organization like the NRWGC to come along and go, no, hang on a minute. Lawrence matters. And it's not that Lawrence is the only guy who matters by any stretch of the imagination, but nonetheless, he's an example. He's a case, actually, of a rank member of the, he was non-commissioned officer. He's a NCO who actually has a grave. A lot of them don't, which actually makes the need to preserve that grave all the more important.
Yeah, it really is. You know, we look at some of the most sort of famous, dare I say, rank and file soldiers from the period, people like Edward Costello from the 95th, you know, practically a household name for anyone who even has a thimble full of love for the period. And we've been to the site where he's buried, and it's sadly been overgrown, and the headstone's gone, and there is just, I understand that there's cost, and I understand that World War I and World War II is more tangible to us in this day and age because of relatives that served, and it's much easier, I think, for people to reflect on those conflicts. But for me personally, it's no less important. And again, it's multinational, isn't it? No matter what you did, no matter which king or emperor or person you served, you have served and you've committed to service. And I think these guys deserve some honor and some respect.
Yeah, I mean, again, spot the veteran who kind of gets it and feels it. Yeah, it is a shame that more isn't made of this. I think, and I do understand that folks don't necessarily have the financial means to support. I completely understand that. But you see a lot of folks who will sort of make the comments about respect and commemoration and all the rest of it, and that's fine and important. And I want people to, you know, continue with that ethos. But if we're going to succeed in helping that be more than just sort of an intangible concept, you know, a nice painting that we've all seen and are inspired by, it does take the work of an organization like the NRWGC to go out in the field, to do the half graft, to make this happen. You know, cleaning Lawrence was not simple. It wasn't an easy, it's certainly easier to clean than some of the graves that we've cleaned as a charity. But it wasn't a simple process. It's a process that takes a long time, takes many months. We use the same methods fundamentally that the Americans used to preserve Arlington National Cemetery, which is very much about long-term preservation of the stone. There are techniques that you can use that some very successful and high-profile grave cleaners do utilize that cause significant damage because they get shorter-term results. The NRWGC doesn't subscribe to that rationale and is very much focused on gentle cleaning techniques that work with nature effectively to sort of sluice the stone, bring out the algae discoloration, which is what causes a lot of the degrading. So I know we keep emphasizing it, folks, but the point of this stream is in part to raise money for the NRWGC. If you're able to donate directly, please go to www.nrwgc.com/donate. I don't know if folks have done that already. If you have, please let us know in the chat, in the comments. We would love to hear from you and to celebrate that and to thank you for your generosity. But equally, if you're one of those who just financially isn't able to, we understand that. That's why we've committed to the fact that every like that this live stream gets will result in £1 being donated to the NRWGC. And if we hit 200 likes, then we will double that total. And somebody very generously earlier, Jonathan Stark very generously offered to match that doubling. So thank you for all the support that you're providing. And please do support in whatever way that you can. So we move on now to the next interview in our lineup. And I'm interviewing somebody somewhat familiar, I have to say, for this next segment. I'm joined by Liam Telfer, who is co-host of the Napoleonic Wars channel and podcast. We refer to him as affectionately as our quartermaster. He's an all-round hero, quite frankly. Not only does he do wonderful things for the show, not only did he formerly serve in the British Army for I forget how many years, but significant numbers of years, much of that with the Household Cavalry. He's now in his day job working for the London Fire Brigade, running into burning buildings and saving people. So if you could kind of find an occupation that doesn't make us all feel deeply inadequate at some point in the next 30 years, Liam, I think we might kind of appreciate it. But it's great to have you on the other side of the microphone for this segment. And I want to talk to you about soldier life, not during your period of service, but during this period of service that we're focused on today, because you do have significant experience as a reenactor. And in fact, we're going to show you some snippets of that now. And the first thing that comes to mind is life on campaign. What's it really like for these guys? Because we get a lot of generalizations. What's the reality, do you think?
Now, I think, first of all, I just want to say that not only life on campaign, but life, particularly for working class people, regardless of nationality, during this period was hard. Like life was a grind for the lower end of the social spectrum. But for the British soldier on campaign, it's physically exhausting. It's dirty at times, and more often deadly way before the battlefield, way before the shooting starts. You know, you can be competing with disease, with all sorts of things that that they wouldn't have experienced on home service. Now, I think there are some misconceptions that we can talk about. The soldiers often would have been billeted. You know, they would, even on campaign, they would have been quartered in barns, in farms. The army found digs for them. They weren't out sleeping under the stars every night, but there are occasions where the primary sources tell us that they're in a bush or in a hedge. You know, Waterloo, they're just stood up on the ridge, some of these guys. And you can imagine how miserable that is. Now, in terms of what they're carrying with them on campaign, you're talking anywhere between probably 24, 25 kilos up to about 30 kilos worth of weight. And the viewers can see that kit that I'm carrying there is around about 27 kilos by the time you add the ammunition belt, the bayonet, the pack, mess kit, haversack with rations and things like that. It does add up. Going on to food and rations now, they were basic and unreliable. We know plenty of occasions where the commissariat couldn't keep up with the army's advance or indeed withdrawal. And a soldier, by the regulations, was allocated to have a pound of bread or biscuit a day, a pound of beef, half a pint of dried peas, an ounce of cheese, an ounce of rice, and then to wash it all down, either 5 pints of beer, a pint of wine, or half a pint of spirits. I think most of the soldiers would have taken the spirits over some of the food, because by the time it got to the lines, it would have been in not the best state. And we know that it wasn't. You talked about Professor Ed Koss's work. He does some excellent work in the Soldier Compendium that talks about how rations weren't nutritionally sufficient in terms of their calories to keep soldiers going. So it would have been a case of pilfering and finding food where they can. But overall, life was hard. But there are some great accounts of soldiers having fun and almost enjoying campaign life as well.
Yeah, I mean, we'll come on to reenactment and that the way in which people can get involved in that in just a second, because I think that's an important thing to emphasize in terms of the enjoyment that can actually be gained through reenactment. But in terms of the practical stuff, as we just see you complete an attempt to fire 4 rounds in a minute there, how practical is that uniform that you wear when you're doing that reenactment?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's a lot of myths around it, thanks to our entry-level drug that is Richard Sharp and Bernard Cornwell. But I mean, first of all, the British Army's uniform of the period is iconic. I think it's something that is ubiquitously iconic across the world for various good and nefarious reasons. But it was designed to be practical within the confines of Napoleonic tactics. And it's designed with discipline, unit identity, and battlefield visibility in mind. Not necessarily comfort, but ultimately the people that came up with these uniforms knew that the soldiers had to be able to fight and move in them. So the majority of the fabric you can see in the video now, it's broadcloth, so it's wool. And for those that don't know, that it wicks away sweat very well, it breathes very well, it dries very quickly. So although it may look hot, and I think that's a bit of a myth that like, oh, you're covered in wool, and yes, it is hot, but wearing lots of layers on a hot day is hot. I wouldn't necessarily put the images you can see here are sort of a post 1812 sort of impression. I wouldn't put that any hotter than wearing, say, full marching kit from the modern army. So it's not as restrictive as I think people think, to sort of myth bust a little bit there. The one I like to always refer to is the leather stock, the neck stock. And again, thanks to our favorite rifleman, it's seen as this, this heinous item that's only good for throwing down range and having guys fire 3 rounds a minute at. Let's be honest, the stock is a fashion of the day, and the army uniform reflects that. It's a reflection of society. And men particularly, and gentlemen certainly, men wore neck stocks because it was smart and it was the right thing to do. Now the army had to come up with a way of doing that would last and that was easily acquired and easily reproduced. Hence you get the leather stock. Now it isn't restrictive. It doesn't affect your breathing. It softens actually, and it's not uncomfortable to wear at all.
So something else that we should talk about is the experience of battle. Some obvious things spring to mind here. Lots of smoke, lots of noise as well, quite obviously. I think some of the things that we don't necessarily think about so much are things like smells, and also tastes, which is something that might perhaps surprise people. So talk us through some of those things.
Yeah, I think the battle for the British soldier, or any soldier, I suppose you could kind of project this onto during the period. I sort of like to term it as organized chaos, because like you say, your visibility is going to be restricted by smoke. These firearms create a lot of smoke. Noise is a big thing. If you've ever been, I know from my experience being in a group of up to 50 or 60 people firing a blank firelock, it is loud and it does affect your hearing. If you're doing that in a group of, upwards to 600, 700, 800 with other people at either side as well, other groups either side, it is going to affect your senses, and I think also your sensibility as well. You know what it's like when you've had a sort of bump on the head, and it kind of almost like a little bit dreamy, and it affects your hearing and your sight and your smell. And I think that's kind of how it would be. It would almost be a buzz of just sort of sensory overload. And you mentioned taste there. It's really interesting because gunpowder is salty. It does taste. You do ingest a little bit when you reload. Smell's a great one. It's just it's so difficult to replicate in books and in textbooks and things, isn't it? But the smell of the smoke, that kind of sulfury, rotten, eggy smell, the smell of mud, particularly at Waterloo, and awfully the smell of human and horse flesh. It's very distinctive. I don't want to dwell on it too much, but we've all been into a butcher's shop. That's that sort of cold meat smell, and whether we like it or not, we are human when we are meat, and when we've been hit by a cannonball, that's what we smell like. So I think it's organized chaos, and I think it's more kinetic than people think. It's not the red lines and blue lines facing off that we probably associate more with the 18th century. It's more kinetic. It's backwards and forwards, and there are lulls. There are periods of boredom in battle where people can get a drink, where they can replan ammunition. It's not like they stand in line, fire 60 rounds, and then bugger off home.
No, it's not. Playing on the screen now, we've got you as part of your efforts for our 4 rounds a minute video that folks can see on our YouTube channel, going through the musket drill. And in fact, Mark Trowbridge comments, great drill. He's an ex-68th reenactor and has a connection to Ed Koss, funnily enough. But in terms of that musketry, folks are also going to see a sneak peek at some footage that we were very privileged to shoot at the Royal Armouries Museum in Leeds with Jonathan Ferguson, in which you got to fire the musket with cannonball, with cannonball, firing a musket with cannonball, that would be problematic. Firing a musket with ball, i.e. loaded with a musket, ball, as opposed to the usual blanks. Talk us through what it was like to fire a musket, and also talk me through your reactions to getting your hands on a literal antique weapon that was the Brown Bess that you fired at the Royal Armouries, and the experience of things like the kick, because I'm sure people would be very interested to hear your reactions to all of that.
I mean, first of all, it was an absolute dream come true. I mean, there are bucket lists and there are bucket lists. You know, the advert, if Carlsberg did bucket lists, this would be it. And I still can't believe this is something that I have done, to fire an 1806, I think it was second model India pattern musket with ball at the Royal Armouries with just anyway, it was brilliant. I'll move on away from the wax and lyrical there. But in terms of the experience itself, I was sort of surprised and not surprised. I was expecting it to kick. I thought I was going to fly across the room, or at least expect to. But I am quite experienced with firearms, as you know. I've been exposed to a lot of firearms over the last 20 years, really. It was a lot more accurate than I expected. That was, I think, my biggest takeaway. And I know we're in on an indoor range, so the distances aren't great, but where you point it, the ball will go, and that spread will obviously increase with range. But I'm genuinely surprised with how accurate I could fire it.
We've had a question come in from Zach Johnson, which I'm just going to jump to very quickly. How much does the flash in the pan of a flintlock affect one's ability to aim-ish with a smoothbore musket? Zach acknowledges he's seen reenactors turn their heads away or shut their eyes. I've been watching the footage of you firing this as well, trying to sort of see, do you shut your eye or not when you're firing these? So what are your thoughts on all of that?
I will always shut my left eye and aim down the barrel, and using that bayonet lug as a sight. The soldiers in the period were trained to aim at marks. We've had this. We've been around the boy with this one before. In terms of that flash, it is very difficult because you pull the trigger, it flashes, and instantly your right eye wants to close. But I think for me personally, I will try and fight that reflex, but also I will pin the firelock into my shoulder, bring my elbows down in order to create as stable a firing platform as possible, so that if my aim is obscured by either a reflex of shutting of the eye or the flash itself, that it doesn't really matter. The ball's going to go where I'm aiming it anyway.
Once again, we're seeing you with Jonathan Ferguson at Leeds, Royal Armouries at Leeds. And our thanks once again to them for that experience. Now, we can't promise everybody who gets involved in reenactment that they're going to get to fire a period Brown Bess with ball with one of the world's most experienced curators of firearms. But nonetheless, we're seeing people come in the chat. David Maxwell, for example, talking about how he's got a 5th Battalion 60th Officers kit. How do people get involved, should they want to, when it comes to reenactment and trying to gain some experience about these men's lives?
I think the more the merrier, as far as I'm concerned. Now, for the viewers that are UK based, I would recommend that your first port of call be the Napoleonic Association. Their website has details of all of the units that are members. Now, each unit is its own sovereign entity. We are part of then the Napoleonic Association as a sort of umbrella organization that helps with things like insurance and event organization. In terms of overseas, it's very similar. A lot of countries, particularly I know the Dutch, Belgium, in Germany and in Spain as well, they have their own iterations of the Napoleonic Association. So that would be my first port of call. And then, research the impression, research the unit that you want to portray, because you'll get much more out of it when you sort of buy into the personal stories of this unit. It's something I've done with the 2nd Battalion, the 44th, and some of these guys I feel like I almost know, and maybe that's elite, but when you've spent so much time in the archives following their stories and following their lives, to put on the red coat in a living history reenactment sense is just an extension of that. So yeah, find a unit that works and do your research and have fun, have fun doing it.
And one final comment that's just come in here from Dutchman. Thanks very much for posting. It's more the flash of the guy next to you that does the most damage. Is that your experience? Have you come away with some significant powder burns from somebody over priming a pan?
It can happen. It can happen. That's why dressing's so important. That's why dressing the ranks is so important, because if the person to your left, and it'll usually be the person to your left, obviously, with the lock being on the right-hand side, if they're not dressed off, if they're, for example, just slightly too far forwards, then you can get a few powder burns. But I see it as all part of the experience.
Liam, great to have you. You're about to stay with us, but great to have you on to talk about that aspect of your expertise. Folks, Liam Telfer, co-host of the Napoleonic Wars channel and podcast, all-round good guy. Doesn't have a book that we can plug yet, but give him time. We're working on him to make sure that he does produce that book in due course. Liam, thanks very much for sharing your insights.
No problem. My pleasure.
So, folks, we have reached the ultimate crisis moment in the story of the Battle of Waterloo. And for the next half an hour, we are going to retell that crisis moment blow by blow, second by second, in real time. A quick stock take for you. By this point in the Battle of Waterloo, on the 18th of June, 1815, 210 years ago right now, Le Haisson has fallen. Papelotte, the other breakwater out on the eastern side of the battlefield, has also fallen. 2 out of those 3 breakwater farms have now gone. Wellington's line is wide open, and whilst the Prussians may well be pressing at Plancenoit, aiming to encircle Napoleon, aiming to cut off his route to Paris, Napoleon has one final desperate roll of the dice that he will utilize over the course of the next 30 minutes. The 27th Inniskillings are literally dying in square trying to hold the crossroads. Wellington's heavy cavalry has gone thanks to their overcharge and overextension earlier in the day. There's some light cavalry left for sure, but Wellington's line is suffering badly from attrition. It's been under fire at this point for nearly 7 hours. The Prussians, of course, are arriving, and that is helping. The 1st Brigade of 1st Corps, that's Zieten's Corps, are arriving to the north of Papelotte. The Battle of Plancenoit continues. The church burns down around the soldiers as they fight inside it, frankly refusing to give up what they see as a crucial point within the context of the battlefield. Bulow's men have been forced out by 2 battalions of Napoleon's Old Guard, but they're attacking again. They're coming in from multiple angles. The village is now occupied by 11 Guard battalions. You've got troops from Lebeau's corps in there. So where is this pressure going? Who is going to crack first? Where is the pressure at its fiercest? This is the crisis moment, and Napoleon knows this. Napoleon is a veteran of so many of these battles. He is the ultimate example during this period of somebody who can judge that moment of when to break the enemy. And so he tries to do precisely that. He commits the Old Guard. The Old Guard who have a fearsome reputation. These are the guys who supposedly have never been beaten. They are the oldest in this case because he sends in the middle and old guard. These are the veterans, although actually the quality has been watered down for the Waterloo campaign. But it's the reputation that matters. Nobody's sitting there on the Allied side and going, oh yeah, no, Napoleon's Guard, we don't need to worry about them on this occasion because they've reduced the criteria. This is it. You are facing the Emperor's best, and you know it. You see them march across the valley, 10 battalions advancing in 3 waves. And actually, that ends up becoming part of the problem. Because they are split, they are not cohesive. And the fact they do not arrive in unison ends up being part of the problem. Now, Liam, it's important for us to emphasize at this point that it's not meant to happen like this. Actually, wave 1 and wave 2 were meant to strike simultaneously. And had they done so, that could have meant very different things. But the third wave is meant to be the reserve. The third wave is meant to be separate in order to exploit the success of that first attempt.
Yeah, that's right. And whilst we don't do counterfactuals, it does make sense that those first two waves would hit the Allied line at the same time, with the third in reserve. Now, I think what's also really important to mention at this point is that it isn't just fighting on the sort of the western side of the main road. There is the remnants of Derlon's corps is now reformed. I think that it's, again, we keep highlighting some myths. The myth that the Union and Household brigades completely shatter Derlon's corps and take it off the board. It clearly doesn't. The men that have reformed, they've had 3, 4, 5 hours to get back into ranks, to sort themselves out, and they're being pushed on the trying to think of it with a map now. They're going on forwards on the eastern side of the road as they did initially. But crucially, at this point now, this is pressure all across Wellington's line, and he hasn't got the troops to reinforce it.
Well, you talk about let's have a map. So let's have a map. Just to reorientate yourselves, folks, Plancenoit is down at the bottom of your screen where you see Monument Prussien. Hougoumont is over on the left-hand side, Monument aux Soldats Français Morts. The domain de la Bataille de Waterloo, which is just north of the Lion's Mound. The Lion's Mound is going to be really significant for understanding quite what's unfolding, because actually the first wave of the Guard advanced through the area of the Lion's Mound and then deployed left out from it. So actually that becomes a really nice focal point when you're touring the battlefield. A lot of people complain about the Lion's Mound in terms of spoiling the battlefield. I don't agree. I like having that kind of focal point. That means you can immediately orientate yourselves in terms of understanding. But this little path that you can see kind of stretching in a little bit of an arc is sort of Wellington's front line. We know Papelotte over to the east has gone. La Haye-Saint has gone. It's all going to be about this central belt of the battlefield. As Liam says, over on the French right flank, so over on the eastern side, there is pressure from Derlon's corps, reformed and pushed back in. Lebeau, of course, is trying to stem off the Prussians over on the eastern flank. So the Imperial Guard here are going to focus on Wellington's line. This is all about trying to achieve that breakthrough, punch that hole through, and send the Allied army reeling. If they can be pushed back and Blucher can be held at bay, Napoleon can live to fight another day. And really, that is what this is about. This is about survival. Somebody's got to give here because there's no opportunity for a dignified withdrawal. And in terms of what happens, as I say, there are 3 waves to this attack. And we've got some drone footage once again to help guide you through this. So playing through now is effectively the route of the advance of the first wave of Imperial Guard. And this first wave consists of the 1st and 2nd battalions of the 4th Regiment of Chasseurs, who are western. The 2nd battalion, 4th are on the left of the attack. Now, these guys face Maitland's Guards Brigade, and this is an iconic moment in the story of Waterloo. They are met by the 2nd Battalion and 3rd Battalion of the 1st Regiment of Guards, i.e. the Grenadier Guards. So guards will meet guards in this part of the battlefield, and Wellington has deployed them on the reverse slope, something that he is famed for. Liam, talk us through the reverse slope concept.
Indeed, yes. So as we've talked about before, we've had quite a lot of artillery raining down on this hill, and this is something that Wellington's used before. He will withdraw his troops to the reverse side of a slope. Not only does that give him the upper hand in terms of intelligence, because the enemy can't count how many troops he has, they can't then predict his deployment, but also it does give the troops behind that slope a good level of protection from artillery fire and indirect fire, and enables them to lie down in some cases, and I wouldn't necessarily say rest, but bide their time until deployments are needed. The great thing about that reverse slope as well, it allows Wellington and his commanders to move troops across the battle space without necessarily being seen. Now, tactically, I think that's really important, and Wellington uses that on several occasions.
There's also an advantage in terms of psychology, right? You've got these troops, they lie down, you can't see them as you're advancing up this slope. And this is the beauty of the drone footage, actually, that you can see as we move forward. You can see the line of the ridge, but you can't see the other side of the hill. And so if these guys are lying down, there's no indication of what's there. You get to the crest of the ridge, the guards are told to stand up, and suddenly it's as though these guys have appeared from nowhere. And so you've got that moment of, oh, I thought we had an empty field, now we've got some guys to fight. It just kind of gives you that jolt, which is part of the reason why, as a tactic, it really does work. The other thing that I often flag with this is that you'll notice, folks, that I'm talking about the chasseurs of the Imperial Guard. Now, the Grenadiers, I'm going to make myself very unpopular with somebody from the Grenadiers one day who's going to come along and give me a piece of their mind. But the Grenadier Guards are supposedly called the Grenadier Guards because they face Napoleon's Grenadiers of the Imperial Guard. Except, as I've just explained to you, they don't face the Grenadiers. They face the chasseurs. So actually, they're misnamed. They should be the chasseurs guards. Now, if you were to suggest that to somebody from the Grenadier Guards, steeped in the history of that unit, I think the response might be quite robust in terms of being invited to go away. But nonetheless, that's the story with the fourth chasseurs. The third chasseurs are on the right of this wave, and they will face Halkett's brigade. This is all British. This is 2nd Battalion 30th, 33rd Regiment, 2nd Battalion 69th, 2nd Battalion 73rd. Only the 2nd Battalion 30th has served in the Peninsular War, so it's not as though this is kind of hardcore experienced Peninsular War division units we're talking about. But also, if you've joined us for the entirety of the live stream, you'll remember the 33rd and the 2nd 69th really got hammered at Quatre. So it's not as though these guys are fresh as daisies, as if they haven't had trauma from the previous day. And I think that's something that is well worth bearing in mind. Now, we've also got a second wave of guards. That's the 1st Battalion 3rd Grenadiers. So there are some Grenadiers that go in at Waterloo, but they don't face that. All right, I've laboured the point enough. You've also got the 4th Grenadiers and the 2nd Battalion 2nd Grenadiers. And they'll face Kilman-Sager's 6 battalions of Hanoverian Landwehr. Landwehr, folks, militia units, not really what you'd want to throw into the line against Napoleon's best and brightest. You've also got Vink's 4 battalions of Hanoverian Landwehr. So you're going to have a situation where, sure, the British are going to see off one wave of the Imperial Guard. The second wave is going to have to be dealt with by the Allies, fundamentally by Hanoverian troops. And then there's a third wave that's acting as the reserve. It consists of the 2nd Battalion 3rd Grenadiers and the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 2nd Chasseurs. Now, Napoleon needs these guys forwards. There's a big question mark about whether or not he's planning to die with these troops, but he's forced to pull up. He's actually told by his officer, look, you need to stop. You need to stop. And so he pulls up about halfway across the valley. Now, if you've watched that monstrosity that is Ridley Scott's Napoleon movie, he does not get within rifle shot. There isn't some rifleman with a telescope strapped to the top of his Baker rifle, because that's really going to impact on the accuracy. Trying to sort of take pot shots. Folks have got questions coming in, mentions about the 52nd, about Chassés division. I'm going to do my best Braveheart impression. Hold, folks. Hold the line. We are getting there. Yes, we are going to do due justice to all folks on all sides of this fight. So let's talk about this first wave. Well, you've seen the footage already. There's a big debate actually about what Wellington says, right, Liam?
Yeah, it just doesn't feel like Wellington to me to sort of wave his bicorns, giving it the old up guards and atom. It feels rather almost like some sort of Victorian construct, if I'm honest, a bit of a music hall morale boost for the Iron Duke as he became. It doesn't feel particularly Duke of Wellington a la 1815.
It doesn't. I definitely prefer the notion that he would turn to Maitland in command of the Guards Brigade and shout, "Now, Maitland, now's your time." It says a lot that Wellington does that. Two things. First, he puts himself in the position of danger. He's always done that all the way through his career. Secondly, he's got to be on the ground telling a very experienced commander like Maitland, yeah, now you can do your thing, Maitland. Now I will allow it. The micromanager to the end. And essentially the guards stand, they deliver a volley, and they charge with the bayonet. And for the 4th Chasseurs, that's it. It's all over. They break. Now that sounds very sort of superb and glorious, but as we're going to discuss, that creates problems, because once you charge forward with the bayonet, that means that you are vulnerable. And that's where the 3rd wave is really going to do its damage. But that's not it in terms of the 1st wave. We need to finish the story with the 1st wave, because to their right, the 3rd Chasseurs are doing much better. They effectively get involved in a musketry duel with Halkett's men, and Halkett's men slowly give ground. So for all that we love to talk about the British story and the British success at Waterloo, actually, sure, these guys fight very hard, but they're not the all-conquering heroes that certain retellings of the Waterloo story would lead us to believe. So, Liam, what does turn the tide against the 3rd Chasseurs?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I just want to highlight one of those units in Halkett's brigade. You've got the 2nd 30th there, the Cambridgeshires. Now, although they are the only Peninsular battalion in that brigade, they were also sent home due to losses. These are going to be pretty green troops. Now, as you say, the 4th Chasseurs have broken. The 3rd Chasseurs are starting to creep forward. They're winning that reload battle, basically. Meanwhile, Kramer's horse battery from Chasse's 3rd Dutch Belgian Division opens fire. It's one of those kind of perfect storm moments, isn't it? Like a second before and a second after, it may not have had the impact it did, but it killed and mortally wounded several of the French officers. Then the 3rd has seen that the 4th's broke and the 3rd's gone. That it's a game changer for momentum, isn't it? That the firing of that cannon and the what more importantly, those Dutch Belgian artillery opening up. I think it's a really important moment.
It is, and what it means is that 1st wave is done. Now the 4th are broken, the 3rd withdraw. Sure, there's scope for them to perhaps reform in due course, but it's not over, because sure, the two waves haven't struck simultaneously, but as the 1st wave breaks, so the 2nd wave strikes, so the pressure is maintained on the Allied line, and it's not like the Guards are able to just kind of get themselves together in the space of a couple of seconds and then go and help. You know, the Hanoverians are going to have to deal with this, except that, you know, we're talking about Kilmansegge, Vink, Landwehr. This is the weak point. This is that section of the line that at one point would have been held by the King's German Legion troops that Orange has expended trying to retake La Haye-Saint. And they give ground. They are pushed back. But as they do so, we reach a really controversial moment in the story of the battle, because as they break, they run not into an open field, they run into a wall of horseflesh.
Yeah, so as you mentioned earlier, the heavy cavalry's practically been spent. Wellington still has a good number of light cavalry available, and they're formed up behind on the reverse slope, waiting for their moment, as it were. As the Hanoverians turn and withdraw, like you said, they meet this cavalry. And the story goes that not only do the cavalry block them, they start threatening them and draw swords. And I'm sure I've read that some of the cavalry actually use the flat of their blades to turn some of these guys around. Now, controversial as that may be, I wonder how much that's been overplayed in the telling since the battle because of the Hanoverians. And I would, again, counterfactuals, I wonder what would have happened if Halked's men had done the same. But I think the general disrespect for the Allies across the army at the time, which we know was a thing, I think that does play into it a little bit here. So the British cavalry have gone, these Hanoverians aren't really worth the salt. Wave your swords at them and hopefully send them back to the front line where they can probably die some more. I think that's perhaps the attitude of the British at the time.
It wouldn't surprise me if that's the case. But once again, we see a multinational effort to try and defeat the Guard, because as this is happening, Chassé springs into action. Somebody asks, are we going to talk about Chassé? Yes, we are going to give Chassé every ounce of the credit that he and his men deserve, because Chassé calls up his men just as Kramer, who really puts in a shift over the course of this half hour, having fired on the first wave of Guards, turns that battery around and fires upon the second French column and causes huge destruction in the process. If folks know the geography, you'll know this is quite a constrained area. And so you're talking very close range artillery fire from a guy who clearly can sight his guns exceptionally well. Kramer is one of the big heroes of Waterloo who really doesn't get the kudos that he deserves. So Chassé brings up the 1st Brigade of Dutch Belgians. These are under Dittmer and consist of the 2nd Line and the 35th Jaegers. Fair enough. But then listen to this. The 4th, the 6th, the 17th, and the 19th Militia. 4 regiments of militia with a line regiment and a Jaeger regiment being hurled at the Imperial Guard, the Emperor's best. This is about weight of numbers. You're just chucking these guys straight into the fray with a bayonet charge. Don't get into the intricacies of musketry. Just bodies against bodies. And the Grenadiers, not unsurprisingly, I would argue, given the sheer weight of numbers that are being hurled against them and the damage that the artillery fire is doing, they beat a hasty retreat. And yet it's still not done. So Wellington's line has been dented when it comes to Halkett's brigade, has been fractured when it comes to the Hanoverian Landwehr, and now a 3rd wave is trying to bear down on the Allied line and exploit this carnage that is being wreaked amongst Wellington's men. Because, as we've talked about already, the Guards on the British side have charged down the slope with the bayonet. That therefore means that they haven't got their cohesion. They're not in a firing line. They are forward. They are away from their support. They are vulnerable. And so the 3rd wave seeks to exploit that advantage and seeks to kind of roll up the Guards. And these guys aren't working alone. They're supported by troops from Foy and Bachelot's divisions, who were from Ray's Corps, who weren't actually involved in the fight for Hougoumont. So this is these guys are relatively fresh. There is an opening here. It's not over for the French. But at this point, Adams' brigade springs into action. Now, this consists of the 2nd Battalion 95th, the 52nd Regiment, the 71st, and the 3rd Battalion 95th. Now, this is a Peninsular War brigade. And what I find incredibly interesting here is that what the 52nd do, they are doing for the 2nd time. Not at Waterloo. They've done it several years earlier at the Battle of Vimero. During that battle, at a key moment, they swing out of the line, flank the French attack, and send it reeling off back into the valley. And here at Waterloo, they're going to do the same thing. Now, at this point, I haven't had the chance to do the research to see if it's the same guys in command, to know if it's that experience that is telling. But I think the similarity of the actions is perhaps telling in itself, because the 52nd do much of the work when it comes to this, seeing off this wave of the Imperial Guard. So we're talking 1,000 strong, Peninsular War veterans strengthening that experience, providing that morale. They fire a series of volleys at the French as they try and force their way up the hill, kind of to the west of the Lion's Mound. Having swung out of the line, incredibly dangerous. There's still a lingering threat of French cavalry in the valley. They know that they have to take that risk, and they fire upon the French and then charge with the bayonet. But they're not done there. And this is what is particularly incredible. As we bring up some of this footage, and I just fast forward, what we're going to do now is track that attack that Adams' brigade carries out, and particularly the 52nd carry out. So you can see them now swinging out of the line as the drone turns. So the French would have been advancing from right to left of shot. You'll be able to see La Haye-Saint appear just in the middle of shot there, the Lion's Mound on the left-hand side. And so having swung out of line, delivered those volleys, charged with the bayonet, they then maintain their formation of line, and they sweep across the face of the Allied army all the way to La Haye-Saint. I'm just going to let the drone footage play out here and trace that shot and trace that journey. Now, they're still mindful of the cavalry threat, the 52nd. And in fact, looking at the accounts, we know that their commander is constantly riding backwards and forwards across this line, checking the progress, checking the stability of the line, and constantly keeping that eye out for the French cavalry, because they are so mindful of what could potentially happen here. And I think that's the experience playing out there. So the third wave, unsurprisingly, decides that discretion is the better part of valor and pulls back. But it's not over. The French are wavering for sure, but they are not entirely broken. Vivian's light cavalry, which is the 10th and 18th Hussars and the 1st KGL Hussars, at this point charge. They're supported by Vandeleur with the 11th, 12th and 16th Light Dragoons, and Dornberg with the 23rd Light Dragoons and the 1st and 2nd Light King's German Legion Dragoons. It's just a full-blooded household / Union Brigade style charge. And in this part of the field, it works. The retreat turns into a rout. Liam, what does Wellington do at this point?
Well, this is the famous moment where he raises his hat, he's cockaded Bicorn and orders the general advance. And I think the weight of relief at this point must have been huge. Now, there's clearly still lots of business to take care of, but knowing that, psychologically knowing, not only for Wellington, but also for his troops, that they would have known that this is the Imperial Guard and they know their reputation. I don't necessarily think that the Allies would have feared them as much in terms of the way we look at the Imperial Guard now, but they've turned the guard. Like that's everything psychologically, and also for the soldiers that have been besieged in Hougoumont on Wellington's right flank, they are going to start to see some relief now.
But what doesn't happen is that the entire French army just runs away because the British have gone on the offensive. Sure, Wellington orders an Allied advance, important emphasis there, but this isn't the only point of a breakthrough. At Plancenoit, the Prussians are achieving a breakthrough as well, and particularly crucially here around Papelotte, which is appearing in the center of screen now, Ziethen's corps have arrived, and they sweep down on the French just as they're moving into the Papelotte complex. So Papelotte, as I said at the start of this monologue, duologue, whatever this has been, has fallen. But as the French are moving in, trying to sort of get their bearings in the area, Ziethen descends upon them and surprises Durrett's men. So this is Durrett's 4th Division that holds, that is fighting in this section of the field. Before they've had a chance to really get to grips, they just get steamrolled by the 1st Prussian Brigade, who smashes their way through, and then they advance south and west. And this is an important thing to emphasize, because it's often claimed that the cry goes up, La Gare recule, and the entire French army runs away. But I'd urge folks, I'm just going to pause the drone footage right there. Now, this footage is taken from approximately 50 meters in elevation. And sure, it's on your computer screen right now, but how much can you see of what's happening over by the Lion's Mound? And bear in mind, we know the Lion's Mound is the focal point for these attacks, or at least the area in which these attacks take place. So judge for yourself. What could these guys see? And then add in the gunsmoke, add in the fog of war, add in all of that uncertainty, add in how far a human voice can travel. And are you seriously telling me that what's happening on that part of the battlefield, well over 2 miles away, is going to suddenly cause the entire French army to run away? No. It's the fact that Zieten breaks through here that causes the French in this part of the battlefield to also withdraw, because as he pushes through, he just heads like an arrow for La Belle Alliance. He is aiming to cut this French force literally in two. Guys, French troops facing Wellington are just going to be cut off entirely. French troops trying to hold back Bulow's corps are equally going to be cut off. It's a case of you've got pressure from the front, you've got pressure from the side, and now you've got two break-ins. And that is what causes the French morale to crumble. The Battle of Waterloo isn't quite over, but for all intents and purposes, it's about how many of these guys can get out before the noose absolutely closes. And with that, we are now going to bring in our final guest who has been waiting very patiently. Folks, just a quick reminder, please do continue to like the stream. As we've been saying throughout this, every like that the stream gets will result in £1 being donated to the Napoleonic and Revolutionary War Graves charity. If we get to 200 likes, we will double whatever the final total is when it comes to that donation. So please do support or go direct to nrwgc.com/donate. But we're now going to talk about the aftermath. We're going to talk about the legacies of not just Waterloo, but of the Napoleonic Wars themselves. And I'm delighted to be joined by, frankly, a trailblazing historian, Evan Wilson, who looks very shocked to be described as trailblazing. But honestly, his book, The Horrible Peace, British Veterans and the End of the Napoleonic Wars, is a book I'm currently reviewing, actually, for a history journal. And it's such an important piece of work in the way that it looks at the Navy veterans alongside the British veterans, and actually talks about that period that everybody loves to forget, because everybody stops talking once the fighting stops. And Evan's book traces what actually happens to these guys. It's a question I constantly ask when I interview people. What happens to these guys after Waterloo? And Evan's book does a fantastic job of addressing this. Evan, in this interview, we're going to talk more about kind of the fabric of how you go about researching something like this. But I do want to just give our viewers a bit of context, first of all. These veterans, whether they fought for the French, the Prussians, the British, I know your book predominantly focuses on the British, these veterans don't get the hero's welcome that we might expect in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars. The simple question I have to ask is why?
Thanks, Zach. Thanks for the kind words. It's great to be here. Why don't the veterans get welcomed home? Well, some do, certainly. Some are welcomed home and feted, and there's certainly a part of the country that is very happy to see them. But the reason the book is called The Horrible Peace is that most everything else is going wrong in the country, especially in Britain. Oh, thanks. Good stuff. It's a case of a economic crisis, a social crisis, a political crisis. I mean, you name it, it all goes wrong in the 5 years after Waterloo, and it's been going wrong for a few years before then too. So when the veterans from Waterloo come home, they're coming back to a country that's really in turmoil and that is not prepared to welcome them in the way that I think they might have wanted to be welcomed. So it's a complicated story. It has to do a lot with the fact that the wars have been dragging on for 20 plus years. And when you try to transition let's call it pre-industrial economy out of from war to peace, there's a lot of friction, a lot of costs associated with that. and there's not a sense among the political leadership that the veterans deserve the kind of social safety net that you might see, for example, in the United States with the GI Bill, or the UK with the NHS, or things like that. Like, that's just not politically, it's not part of the discussion, right? So instead, you get veterans who, you know, they're supposed to come home and, okay, find a job, right? I mean, if you're discharged from the military, if you're discharged from the Navy, you're expected to go just figure it out. So it takes a long time for everybody to get home. We can talk about that a little bit too, but the bottom line is that they're coming back to a country that's not in great shape.
Evan, thanks so much for coming on, and I'm a huge fan of your book. I know Zach mentioned it, but I think it's an incredibly needed piece of work, and I'm really interested. Like, how did you decide on this topic?
Well, let's take a step back and say that first books are hard. I'm looking at Zach, right? Zach, first books are hard. What people don't, I'm not disputing how hard first books are, but you get a lot of help to write your first book if you're in graduate school. Now, if you're not in graduate school, it's a different story. But if you're in graduate school, there's a whole army of people that is there to help support you through your first book. You've got help designing the project, scoping it, identifying sources, understanding where the weaknesses are, going off to the archives. You might not be paid much, right? A graduate student stipend is nothing, but you're sort of nobly poor, right? You have this poverty and dedication to the work and time to do it, and that's great. Second books, I discovered, this is my second monograph, are really hard because all that support goes away. You're like, oh, I think I've done this before. It should be easier. It is not easier, my friends. So the bottom line is that you look for support where you can. You try to maintain your network. And a key member of my network, my professional patronage network, was Roger Knight, who is one of the few naval historians who's ever written about the Army. And he said to me in a conversation, it was at the Athenaeum Club, actually, I remember it vividly. He said, you know, nobody's ever written a book about demobilization, about what happens at the end of the wars. And I sort of filed that away as I went about my career, and it stuck with me. And I decided that as I was looking for jobs and trying to get on the academic market, that this would be a good way to go about it. And so the thing that I thought would be exciting about the project is basically twofold. One is it would force me to speak a little bit of Army. As you guys know, I don't really speak Army, but it would be nice to learn a little bit of Army, because it always felt, when you're trained as a naval historian, you just feel like, I guess I'm supposed to know about the Army, but nobody ever teaches me that stuff. So, and I'm sure the Army feels the same way about the Navy. So there's a difficulty in bridging that gap. So I thought, hey, this is a good way to force myself to learn about the Army. That's one. And then two is, if you write a book across big dates in history, you often discover new perspectives. So what I set out to do is to try to say, everybody writing in military and naval history uses 1815 as the end of the era and the beginning of a new one. What happened? But like, they didn't, I mean, everybody knew that Waterloo mattered at the time, but nobody was like, we are now entering a new era. And, you know, you just sort of like say, oh, we're going to stop all the history books and start them over again, right? No, it was 1816, and then it was 1817. Just as as we live life today, we all look back on COVID and say, well, that was clearly some sort of important marker, and probably there will be history books written that use 2020 as a marker, but 2021 just came right along, and here we are, right? So I thought maybe I can write across the barrier. So I tried to start in about 1812 and finish in about 1825. And I think when you shift a perspective to look across a big military naval barrier like that it can add some new perspectives. So that was what I was trying to do.
Evan, I want to sort of start to dig into the how of the book in terms of trying to find the material, because everybody has always said, oh, it's very difficult to trace this. You know, these guys sort of disappear off into the ether. It has been the mantra that I've heard quite a few times from researchers. And I suspect there will be folks watching this who will be thinking, I'd quite like to do some digging myself. So in terms of that source base, talk us through the challenges that you faced in terms of finding this material on these guys, and how did you deal with that and navigate around it?
First of all, you have to just love yourself a little bit and just say, I can't find everybody, and that's going to have to be okay. And so I don't try to make claims in the book that the veterans that I looked at are 100% representative of every veteran, that every that they are representative of every veteran that ever fought in the Napoleonic Wars, and that I've captured every flavor of veteran. Absolutely. I mean, you just have to say to yourself, nope, it's just frankly not going to happen. Now, different services handle this differently. This is one of the ways that the Army and the Navy are different. The Army does have some pension records, and then there are the hospitals that do keep records of veterans. And so you can go digging in there and find some interesting stuff. The hospitals, of course, are complicated by the fact that the inpatient, the in-resident pensioners are different from the out pensioners, and the records there are different. And so you do end up sort of overwhelmed by the quantity of data available, but also the pieces that are missing. The Navy, for example, is really hard on this. I know this is an Army audience, but we can learn a little bit about the Navy here. And that is that, when a ship ships basically only survive at sea without needing a refit for about 2 to 3 years maximum. And then they have to go back to the docks and the crew gets dumped out and usually turned over to a new ship. But at the end of the war, there's no new ship. And so the crew is just discharged and they're gone. And as far as the Navy is concerned, have a good life. See ya. And if you have been injured, you could maybe apply for a pension through Greenwich, and that's one thing. But basically, the Navy doesn't have any way of tracking sailors after they're gone, after they've been paid up and they've got all their prize money and they got all the whatever. Just see you later. So what I was doing with sailors, for example, was looking at, well, what's the job market like? So where do these guys likely go? So you can do a little bit of studies on that. And sailors, unlike soldiers, have a marketable skill. So they are theoretically able to go from the Navy to the merchant marine, and that all sounds great. The problem there, of course, is that 100,000 sailors are trying to do that at the same time, because the 100,000 sailors get discharged from the Navy, so the market's flooded and there are no jobs. So that's one part of the story of the book, is just watching the sailors leave the Navy and then realize, well, if we're all trying to go into the merchant marine at the same time, nobody's going to get a job. So I didn't need highly detailed records of every ebb and flow of the maritime labor market in order to tell that story. I needed some memoirs of sailors for whom that happened to them, and I needed some sense of the sort of broad swaths of how a discharge happened. So the Navy story, I felt like it's not going to be 100% representative, of course, but I'm lucky that Sarah Caputo, whose work I really respect, and I have come to basically the same conclusion on how the sailors, how many sailors there were. And now I will, okay, I'm covering, right. Okay. Now I'm going to, sorry. Hi. Maybe that was for Liam. Great. Sorry. We're live streaming. This is happening. Okay. Hi. The Army story is definitely harder. Army enlistments are fixed term. A lot of soldiers do end up getting discharged at the end of the wars, but not all of them. So a lot of them go back under the Empire. So one of the stories that I had to tell was just tracing regiments as they headed off into the Empire, and that's a story that I could tell with personal stories for sure. But also, it was a story of grand strategy. Like where did the Army need to send its regiments? What was the Empire doing after 1815? One of the stories that we could talk about here, since you guys just finished up with literally the last actions at Waterloo, is that June 18th is not the end of the story, even in 1815. I mean, there's fighting all the way until November. I think the last French fortress surrenders, and don't quote me on that, but sometime in November of that year. And there's also a student of mine did an interesting research project about the last fortress to surrender in the West Indies, because of course the news took a long time to trickle out there that, hey, this is all over, time to give up. Are you sure? Maybe you're tricking me, all those sorts of things. So some of the story is just trying to trace the strategy and the operations of the post June 18th period, and look at the 1815, 1816, 1817, and watch where the regiments go. And that does help try to figure out sort of what the big stories are to look at, and that helps you look for representative samples. But again, I go back to what I said at the beginning, which is you just have to have some self-love and say, I'm not going to cover everything. I can't cover everything. No book can cover everything. Someone else is going to come along, like you saw the note about the podcast there. Somebody else is going to come along and hopefully build on the work. That's especially true when it's a relatively understudied subject.
We talked a little bit earlier, Evan, about the sort of the comments about Ney and the potential for his having PTSD and how that affected him. during, post 1812, and particularly obviously during Waterloo. Now, we all know, we can look now online and find the sort of modern indicators of physiological and psychological the impact of war on the human being in that sense. How do we navigate that in the early 19th century without being able to sort of assess these people?
So I resisted the temptation to diagnose anybody with a modern illness. That said, it clearly is there, but I think you're right to be very skeptical of saying, "Oh, Ney had PTSD, therefore we're going to diagnose him with that," without ever having been able to evaluate him. And none of us are. I mean, I don't know about our audience, but I doubt that any of us are actually qualified to diagnose anybody with PTSD. We see that he was acting maybe irrationally, or he was acting in some sort of traumatized way. So I tried to use the language of the time, and the language of the time was to talk about things like nostalgia. And it's an interesting idea that what the soldiers especially were missing was the experience of being part of the family of the regiment. That it explains a lot of their sort of depression after the war. Some of the examples of soldiers that are behaving in strange ways. And so I have a couple of good memoirs, and there's some good work that's been done on this. Both there's an article in the Journal of Military History that the author whose name I'm forgetting talks about this. But there's some good work that's been done on military memoirs and people who we would see them as PTSD, but we don't want to call them that. But we would say, okay, well, what are the forces that are acting on them that are causing them to behave maybe in this way? And the way they talked about it at the time was things like nostalgia, or a sort of loss of identity or purpose, less so than like the First World War style shell shock. That's not what you usually saw among veterans. I'm sure there are examples of it, but it was a different reaction to the nature, or sorry, to the character of the war. Clausewitz is saying about the nature of war doesn't change, but the character does. And I think that the character of war in the Napoleonic period created a different reaction to the trauma of combat than maybe it did in later wars. So I also think that's another reason to be really skeptical about just wildly diagnosing people left, right, and center. That said, obviously there's effects of the war, and you can see evidence of people that are behaving in ways that we would sort of pick up on and say, hey, that looks like something that I could look up on WebMD. But yeah, so I resisted it in the book, but that's not to say that it wasn't there.
Evan, thanks for covering for me whilst I dealt with a pigeon that was trying to fly through my window. This is the joys of live streaming during the summer. I did
it very poorly, Zach, so don't thank me. It was a disaster. But
I wasn't there to see it, therefore you did a masterful job.
That's right.
But just in case anybody's concerned, the pigeon is absolutely fine. So one of the things that I praised about your book, and I maintain is one of the most important things, it kind of acts as an example to the rest of us, is you put the army and the navy alongside in a way that people just tend not to have done. And I'm curious about the why, because this is, when you think about it like this, it's so obvious. And I'm trying to deal with exactly the same problem in my own research in a very different context, where I'm kind of going, look, this is great. I've got loads of stuff on the army. Why hasn't anybody compared the two in terms of they're both doing fighty stuff, technical term there, folks. So therefore, why wouldn't we kind of put the two side by side and see if there is commonality? But it just doesn't seem to have happened in a meaningful way. What do you feel is going on?
Oh man, that's like setting me up with the biggest softball you could possibly imagine. Please, people, it is possible to write about multiple services. It is possible, believe it or not. It can be done. It's not actually that hard. I mean, maybe I blew it in the book, but I really don't. I was intimidated by how hard it was going to be. I mean, you got to learn a little bit of a different language. I think that's probably the biggest barrier. Most historians sort of come up with they get interested in either the Army or the Navy for reasons that have often they're personal reasons that don't necessarily match any kind of intellectual rationale for it. This is not restricted to Britain in the 18th and 19th century. This is true in most military history, in most times and places, as far as I can tell. In fact, the irony of trying to get the Army and the Navy to talk to each other is that my current job at the U.S. Naval War College exists in U.S. law because in the 1980s, after Vietnam, the United States said the Army and the Navy are not talking to each other. We should make them do that and send them to school together for joint professional military education. And every major military power in the world has some version of this where you have to get the Army and the Navy talking to each other. So the fact that the Army and the Navy themselves struggle with this problem and struggle to get people in conversation with each other, in part, I think, explains why historians have struggled with it, but it shouldn't excuse it, because they are similar institutions. They're operating in the same wars. They're supposed to be on the same team. Sometimes you have to remind them that they're on the same team. Famously, in amphibious operations, that was always the challenge, is to say, no, we're on the same side here, guys. Let's shoot the other guy, not us. But nevertheless, I think that there is an opportunity in most times and places for people to speak across the institutional lines there and say, hey, Zach, you know a lot about the Army. I bet you have something to say to naval historians. Like, I bet you do. I know you do. And so if you can talk to naval historians, that's an audience that needs to hear what you have to say. And I think that that's the most important thing that I came out of this book with, is just an enthusiasm for jointness, which, I don't know if that'll stick. My next book is going to be a biography of an admiral, so it hasn't stuck in my own career. But nevertheless, I think I do think it's important, and I think it's something to keep in mind for especially any young scholar out there who's looking for a subject. Like, just talk across, just get them to talk to each other. It is possible. You might need to find a second expert, right? Your supervisor, if you're in grad school, probably is an expert in either one or the other. Well, there are other people out there. They will, in fact, answer emails. So just a thought.
Evan, you've spoken with massive passion about that. I know that you're going to be joining what we're sort of delicately terming the after party for patrons of the show, which will be hosted privately. So it's a special thing that we offer the people who support this channel and make a lot of this content possible. So for our fan base, the opportunity to put some questions to you continues. There's been a lot of support for your book, some lovely comments. David Maxwell flagging that it's a great book. And folks, I can't recommend this book highly enough. The Horrible Peace, British Veterans and the End of the Napoleonic Wars, available wherever you go and buy your books. It's one of those books that I think could start to become a bit of a paradigm shift in terms of how military historians start talking. We talk a lot about the fantastic work that Alex Mikaberidze has done in terms of bringing that global perspective, and that is going to be one of the standout texts that people are going to go, that was a point where people started to think a little bit differently. And I fervently hope that Horrible Peace is an example of that as well, because it is so important, as you've advocated so passionately here, that the two talk to one another. And if folks want an indication of that, we've talked about Maitland at Waterloo. Well, there's another Maitland who ends up wrapping up the story of the Napoleonic Wars. The Maitland who arrests Napoleon when he tries to flee to America. So these families were willing to speak cross-service and serve in such a way. So it's really, really important. The Horrible Peace, British Veterans and the End of the Napoleonic Wars. Evan, you and I will chat very soon over on the after party. But for now, thank you so much for joining us here on Waterloo Live.
Thanks so much, Zach. Thanks for having me. Thanks, Liam. I appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.
And folks, we now move to the close. Fundamentally, we have been on air for 3.5 hours, and frankly, it's felt like it's flown by. Of course, the fighting is not over. The Guard will attempt to make one final stand, not in the way that you might think, and not in the place that you might think. Those of you who've been to the Waterloo battlefield will know of the Wounded Eagle Monument, which legend says marks the spot where the Guard stood and died to a man, trying to fend off the approaching hordes that were the Allied army. The Imperial Guard does stop and stand for a time in square. They actually do so further to the north, first of all, just kind of buying that little bit of time for elements of Derlon's troops, but also elements of Ray's corps to kind of filter behind them, and then conducts a very controlled withdrawal. If you've watched the Waterloo film, you'll have seen that scene where the cavalry stand within arm's length of the guard square and tell them to surrender, and then the guard shout merde, and the cavalry trot away, and then suddenly about 1 billion cannons have sprung out of nowhere right up behind the cavalry and blast the guard to pieces. That isn't the reality of what happened. There is another point where they stand at a farmhouse further to the south. So the guard, for all that they have been beaten in that assault, still play their part and still try and buy the French time. Napoleon cuts and runs. He has to at this point. His hope is that he can facilitate a concentration around Charleroi. He has troops still in decent order, because throughout all of this, we haven't had the opportunity to talk about Marshal Grouchy and the Battle of Wavre, a really important aspect that we have talked about on the wider podcast. So if you're interested in that, please do check our back catalogue. But fundamentally, once he reaches Charleroi, he realizes that it's over. He will therefore ride straight to Paris, where he has a decision to make, because Waterloo and the Waterloo campaign has been a big roll of the dice. Try and break these two allied armies and then see what happens. With that gone, with his troops a wreck, he's now got to make a decision on whether he can survive the political fallout. His brother tries to urge him, Lucien just urges him to dissolve the constitution, to rule by decree. He says that all is possible if Napoleon will only dare to believe. But Napoleon has finally taken a hefty dose of reality. He turns around to Lucien and replies that he has dared only too much already. He will therefore abdicate for a second time and attempt to flee to North America. He won't succeed. As we've said already, Maitland will capture him, bring him to the shores of the UK, where he will not be permitted to land, and Napoleon will ultimately be exiled to St. Helena, chained like Prometheus to a rock in the South Atlantic. For the Allies, well, it's not over for them either. Wellington and Blucher will meet at 10 p.m. at the what was Napoleon's headquarters, La Belle Alliance. Blucher will reach across from the saddle, no doubt still sore from his tumble at Ligny 2 days earlier, grasp Wellington warmly by the hand, and declare, "Mein lieber Kamerad, quelle affaire." And what an affair it had been. An estimated 20,000 casualties in an area 3 kilometers wide and 1.5 kilometers deep. Waterloo is over. The bloodshed 210 years ago was almost over. There would be more fighting in France to come. But for the wounded and for those who lost loved ones, the suffering went on. And the battle for the history of Waterloo has raged ever since. It's a testament to the significance of the battle that you folks have all very kindly joined us for this commemorative live stream. As I say, it's not over yet for patrons. They are now piling into the dedicated chat room for a follow-up to this. But I want to say a massive thank you to everybody. We didn't make the 200 likes. Liam, I'm not sure if you've been checking at the last count. I think I made it about 76 or something like that.
Yeah, that's right. I think it has ticked over into 80s, but I think we're still in the low 80s.
Okay, low 80s. But tell you what, I'll double it anyway, because it's a good cause. That might have been the plan all along, quite frankly, and just sort of was trying to encourage people along. John, if you, seeing as we didn't make the mark, if you don't feel inclined to match us on that, I fully understand. Equally, if you do, that would be fantastic. Todd Campbell from the NRWGC's Board of Trustees says 82, which is still fantastic. Thank you, folks, for your support. Thank you for trying to raise as much money as humanly possible. That therefore means we will donate £164 to the Napoleonic and Revolutionary War Graves charity, and Todd says that he will match us. Thank you very much for that, Todd. So this is fantastic. A huge amount of money raised for a fantastic cause that is campaigning around the world to try and restore veteran graves, to give them the dignity of a marked place in the earth, and turn these sites into local places of memory so that you don't have to tune into a live stream to remember the Napoleonic Wars. Instead, you can literally step outside and walk to your nearest village church and pause by the grave of a veteran who will no doubt be buried there, and remember their suffering and their sacrifice. A massive thank you to our guests, Dr. Luke Reynolds, to Dr. Graham Callister, and to Dr. Evan Wilson. And a huge thank you to my partner in crime and co-host, Liam Telfer. Folks, this work doesn't happen by magic. If you're able to back us, please hit the subscribe button, because it helps us to reach a wider audience. If you'd like to go deeper, we do have a Patreon page, which is what enables us to go and film this drone footage that you've seen. Details on that are in the ticker tape at the bottom of the screen now. Liam, massive thank you once again. It's always a joy to ride with you here on the show. Folks, this has been the Battle of Waterloo live from the Napoleonic Wars channel. We will be back very, very soon. Thank you for watching, and good night.